and Astoria Boulevard, and my profession is actor, writer, producer, animated voice. Well, I think the importance of the PSI alumni is to help kids and to remind them how important education is. Join me and other alumni at psalumni.nyc. Become part of the first citywide public alumni network. Help support the next generation of New Yorkers.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311 or visit nyc.gov.
This is HPD Commissioner Maria Torres-Springer. Heat season starts October 1st, and the indoor temperature must be at least 62 degrees overnight, regardless of the outdoor temperature. During the day, if it falls below 55 degrees, it should be 68 degrees inside. If heat isn't being provided, call the property owner. If it's not fixed fast, call 311. Learn more at nyc.gov/HPD.
Hi, I'm Bita Mostofi, the Acting Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Deferred action for childhood arrivals and temporary protected status are crucial protections for many immigrant New Yorkers, but the Trump administration has put these programs at risk. If you or someone you love have questions about DACA, TPS, or other immigration matters, call 311 and say Action NYC for a free and confidential legal screening. To learn more, visit nyc.gov/immigrants.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311.
Hi, I'm Roy Mogolansky, Executive Director of the City of New York Office of Payroll Administration. City employees, did you know that when you sign up for the WageWorks Commuter Benefits Program, you'll save money on your commute to work by having funds set aside from your paycheck before taxes are taken out? So you'll pay less in taxes, up to $1,200 a year if you take mass transit alone, and up to $2,400 if parking is part of your commute. Visit getwageworks.com/NYC.
Police officers should always treat you with respect. I'm Jonathan Darsh, Executive Director of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. The CCRB independently investigates, mediates, and prosecutes complaints of police misconduct. If you, or someone you know, has faced misconduct, file a complaint now. Learn how at nyc.gov/CCRB complaint.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311 or visit nyc.gov.
What's up, guys? I'm Prince Royce. Join me and other alumni at psalumni.nyc. PS alumni is important because these are the people that are able to make it, and they were able to go through, through high school, through college, get jobs, and are able to kind of connect with those kids that are struggling with obstacles and maybe don't know what they want to be when they grow up. So I think that PS alumni is definitely important to have people that can really connect with these kids that are going through what all of us go through in high school.
Hi, I'm Marisa Lago, Director of the New York City Department of City Planning. Are you one of the 400,000 New Yorkers who lives in the floodplain? If so, the Department of City Planning wants to hear from you. We're working with residents of flood-prone coastal communities to create special zoning regulations that will make your neighborhood more resilient. Watch our video and then share your ideas at nyc.gov/resilient neighborhoods.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311.
Hi, I'm Eric Landau, President of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Join us on the beautiful Brooklyn waterfront, where you can kayak along the river, shoot hoops on Pier 2, barbecue at the Picnic Peninsula, ride the historic Jane's Carousel, or just take a leisurely walk through the park. Brooklyn Bridge Park has something for everyone. And there's more to come next summer when we open Pier 3, the final pier to be converted into parkland. For more information, call 311 or visit brooklynbridgepark.org. See you in the park.
I'm City Controller Scott Stringer. An honest day's work deserves an honest day's pay. And if you work for a contractor on a city construction or building services project, you should be getting paid the prevailing wage. If you think you've been underpaid, Call my Bureau of Labor Law at 212-669-4443. All calls will be kept confidential, and we'll fight to get you the money you're owed, regardless of immigration status.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311 or visit nyc.gov.
Hola, soy la comisionada Lorelei Salas del Departamento de Asuntos del Consumidor. Si en el año pasado usted ganó $66,000 o menos, puede declarar sus impuestos con nuestro servicio gratuito de Free Tax Prep y recuperar el total de su reembolso. Llame hoy al 311 o visite la página de Free Tax Prep en el sitio web de la ciudad, nyc.gov/taxprep.
I'm Mark Benjamin, a comedian here in New York City. Folks, winters are no laughing matter. The extreme cold and heavy snow and ice can be very dangerous. I always make sure I bundle up with layers, a hat, scarf, and gloves before I head out into the cold. For tips on how you can prepare, visit nyc.gov/emergency management or call 311. And don't forget to sign up for Notify NYC to get free emergency alerts. Stay safe this winter.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311 or visit nyc.gov.
Hi, I'm Department of Consumer Affairs Commissioner Lorelei Salas. Did you earn $66,000 or less last year? You can file your taxes for free with NYC Free Tax Prep and keep your entire refund. Call 311 or visit nyc.gov/taxprep to learn about trusted professional filing with NYC Free Tax Prep.
Hi, I'm Joe Esposito, Commissioner at New York City Emergency Management. Be the first to know when an emergency happens with Notify NYC. Get the free app today for your Apple or Android device. You can also visit nyc.gov/notifynyc. Call 311 or follow @NotifyNYC on Twitter. Remember, a notified New Yorker is a prepared New Yorker.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311.
This is City Controller Scott Stringer. Your credit score isn't just a number. It's the key to financial freedom. That's why we have a proposal to add rent payments into credit reporting. Making rent count could mean lower bills, cheaper borrowing rates, and higher scores for New Yorkers. To learn more about how to get rent added to your credit score, visit controller.nyc.gov and search for Making Rent Count.
My name is John Leguizamo. I grew up in Queens, Jackson Heights, Corona, and Astoria Boulevard. And my profession is actor, writer, producer, animated voice. Well, I think the importance of the PSI alumni is to help kids and to remind them how important education is. Join me and other alumni at psalumni.nyc. Become part of the first citywide public alumni network. Help support the next generation of New Yorkers.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311 or visit nyc.gov.
This is HPD Commissioner Maria Torres Springer. Heat season starts October 1st, and the indoor temperature must be at least 62 degrees overnight, regardless of the outdoor temperature. During the day, if it falls below 55 degrees, it should be 68 degrees inside. If heat isn't being provided, call the property owner. If it's not fixed fast, call 311. Learn more at nyc.gov/HPD.
Hi, I'm Bita Mostofi, the Acting Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Deferred action for childhood arrivals and temporary protected status are crucial protections for many immigrant New Yorkers, but the Trump administration has put these programs at risk. If you or someone you love have questions about DACA, TPS, or other immigration matters, call 311 and say Action NYC for a free and confidential legal screening. To learn more, visit nyc.gov/immigrants.
Remember, for more information about New York City government services, dial 311.
Hi, I'm Roy Mogolansky, Executive Director of the City of New York Office of Payroll Administration.
I'll live with this, but again, what I would like to do is go through and keep on average. You see, just for apples to apples. So we're right here highlighting average, we carry it through and everything. Sure. Yep. Thank you.
We'll be starting in just a minute or two. So. Good morning, everyone. I'm Helene Weinstein, Chair of the New York State Assembly's Ways and Means Committee and co-chair of today's hearing. Today we begin an eighth in a series of hearings conducted by the Joint Fiscal Committees of the Legislature regarding the Governor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2018-2019. The hearings are conducted pursuant to the New York State Constitution and the legislative law. Today, the Assembly Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee will hear testimony concerning the governor's budget proposal for local governments. I will now introduce the members from the Assembly, and Senator Young in a few moments will introduce the Senate Finance Committee members, and our ranker, Assemblyman Bob Oakes, on Ways and Means will introduce the members from his conference. Just before, so let me just, I'm not sure if anybody snuck in, but we have from the Assembly our City's Chair, Assemblyman Mike Benedetto, our Local Governments Chair, Assemblyman Magnarelli. We have Assemblywoman Rosick, Assemblyman Cusick, Assemblyman Carroll, Assemblywoman Nolan, Assemblywoman Seawright, Assemblyman Mosley, Assemblyman Sepulveda, Assemblyman Ortiz, Assemblyman Buchwald, and Assemblyman Ryan. Mr. Oaks?
Yes, we also have Assemblywoman Meliatakis and Assemblyman Castorina.
Hi, I'm Senator Liz Kruger on behalf of Kathy Young, who's running a little late. We have with us today the chair of the Local Government Committee, Kathy Marchione, the chair of the Cities Committee, Simca Felter, Brian Benjamin, Roxanne Persaud, Gustavo Rivera, Kemp Hannon, Elaine Phillips, Diane Savino, and Brad Hoylman.
Before introducing our first witness, I'd like to remind all of the witnesses testifying today to keep your statement within your allotted time limit so that everyone can be afforded the opportunity to speak, and particularly for the members, the witnesses whose testimony has been submitted in writing, you'll be made a part of the record, and those that emailed it likewise, so there's no reason to read your testimony verbatim. In fact, we prefer a summary as we move forward. And just a reminder to both members and witnesses to keep your eye on the clock so that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. We did send a notice around to the Assembly members noting that the mayor needed to leave at 1 p.m., so let's try and get as close to that goal as possible. Senator Young, Senator Kruger ready to introduce the members, but if you have some opening remarks.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The roads were a bit dicey coming from the western regions of the state, so I apologize for being a couple of minutes late, but I do want to welcome you, Mayor. So glad to have you here this morning, bright and early, and very much look forward to your testimony.
Thank you.
Mayor de Blasio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Weinstein and Chair Young, so much. I want to thank also the ranking minority member, Senator Kruger, and Assemblyman Oaks, and I want to thank the leaders of this legislature, Assembly Speaker Hasty, Senate Majority Leader Flanagan, Senate Democratic Conference Leader Stewart Cousins, IDC Leader Klein, and Assembly Minority Leader Kolb. My thanks to all the members here as well today. And I'm joined by two key members of my team, our new Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Melanie Hartzog, and our new Director for State Legislative Affairs, Simonia Brown. I want to begin by thanking the legislature on behalf of all 8.5 million New Yorkers. Over the past 4 years, New Yorkers have seen change happen quickly, and that is thanks in large measure to our work with this legislature. Together, we have given 70,000 children a strong head start in life through pre-K for all. Together, we've helped people throughout the 5 boroughs to stay in the neighborhoods they helped to build. And together, we've saved lives and prevented tragedies by expanding Vision Zero. Together, we have certainly made New York City safer, stronger, and fairer. Now I want to turn to the city's fiscal year 19 preliminary budget, which I presented last week, and it included some important but modest new investments. And these were undertaken with one singular goal in mind: to make New York City the fairest big city in America. These investments include $200 million for heating upgrades to the 20 New York City Housing Authority developments most in need, $12 million for the rollout of body-worn cameras to all NYPD officers on patrol 1 year ahead of schedule, and $7 million for additional staff to implement new tenant harassment prevention laws enacted in partnership with the City Council. As always, our budget is balanced and based on careful management of our resources, which is particularly important given what we are seeing in Washington. Without further action from Washington, federal policies could have a minimum of a $700 million negative impact on our fiscal 19 New York City budget. This includes the cuts to DISH, or disproportionate share hospital payments. That would cost our Health and Hospitals Corporation $400 million annually. A corporate tax rate cut in the new tax law that will make the low-income housing tax credit less valuable. That will add about $200 million a year in capital dollars to our bottom line, making affordable housing production more expensive. And the new tax law eliminates a form of bond refinancing we use to save money. The estimated cost would be $100 million a year. There are also negative consequences for our residents' bottom line. The new tax law, of course, caps the state and local tax deduction, eliminates the personal exemption. This means hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, most earning less than $100,000, will pay more taxes. And I want to commend the governor for trying to find ways to blunt the effects of the new tax law, and I look forward to working with him and all of you on solutions. In addition to the tax law, we are also anticipating a new budget proposal from the Trump administration in the coming weeks, and that will likely be as painful as the last one. Now I want to turn to the governor's executive budget. Last year, I made the point that New York succeeds when New York City succeeds and vice versa. And that is even more important now. There are key items in the executive budget that are positive for our state and our city. I've been speaking for years about the urgent need for election reform. All New Yorkers should be glad that early voting and same-day registration are in the executive budget, and I want to applaud the Assembly Democratic Conference's past work on this issue. Exercising a fundamental right to vote is just too difficult in our state, and 2 million New Yorkers, 1 million of them in the city, aren't even registered. I urge the legislature to include early voting and same-day registration in the enacted budget, and please also include other critical reforms. No excuse absentee ballots, electronic poll books, and pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. It's also important that the DREAM Act is in the executive budget, given what's happening in our country, and New York State can lead by example by helping all of our students, and I urge you to include the DREAM Act in the enacted budget. On criminal justice, we are pleased that the governor included bail reform and speedy trials in his executive budget. This will help reduce the population in city jails and accelerate our efforts to close Rikers Island. For the first time in 85 years, we have made it the city's policy to close Rikers Island for good. But to do so, we need to reduce the number of people incarcerated. The city has taken prudent steps to reduce our jail population by 21% already in the last 4 years, bringing the number of incarcerated people to under 9,000. We have achieved this by driving crime to historic lows, reducing arrests for low-level infractions, and making a $20 million annual investment in supervised release and case delay mitigations. And we are now able to close the first of the 9 jails on Rikers Island. That will happen in June. I also support ending money bail, and I think we should go further, letting judges factor risk to public safety into bail decisions for all cases, while providing them the tools to minimize racial biases. I would urge you to pass another helpful legislative change that's not in the executive budget. This would allow city prisoners serving less than a year to earn reduced sentences for good behavior like they can in state jails. In addition, I would urge the state to move state-supervised parolees in city jails who violate parole into available space in state correctional facilities. The changes I've just outlined would help reduce our jail population by another 1,800 people per day, bringing us closer to our stated goal of 5,000. Another key element in the closure plan is the construction of the necessary borough-based jails. Design-build authority for the construction of local correctional facilities would help speed the construction timeline. We're also improving the culture inside of the jails. Our corrections officers are receiving new professional development and support, and all inmates in our jails now receive 5 hours a day of therapeutic, vocational, and educational programming. We've reduced the number of people in punitive segregation by 80% and ended it for women and those under 21 years old. And this spring, through our Jails to Jobs program, everyone who leaves jail following a city sentence will be offered a transitional job. Now, I'd like to talk about another critical step in closing Rikers Island, which is removing 16 and 17-year-olds. And I want to thank you all for your historic vote to enact Raise the Age. But I'm concerned that the fiscal 19 executive budget makes this an unfunded mandate by providing zero guaranteed funding. This will cost the city at least $200 million per year. The city is working hard to comply with this mandate. We're renovating 2 facilities, Crossroads in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and Horizon in Mott Haven in the Bronx. For additional capacity, we need the Ella McQueen Juvenile Reception Center in Ocean Hill, Brooklyn, transferred to the city. I urge you to help make this happen. We cannot meet the October 1st deadline without this center serving as our intake facility. The executive budget also defunds the city's juvenile justice facilities under the Close to Home program. This cut undermines this signature reform designed to keep kids closer to their families. And it will cost the city $15.3 million in fiscal 18 and $31 million in fiscal 19. Now I'd like to discuss a number of areas of concern in the governor's executive budget. I made it clear that the city should not be required to pay half of the MTA Subway Action Plan. Our current contribution to the MTA is one big reason why. New York City residents, workers, businesses, and government contribute nearly 70% of the MTA's total revenues, more than $10 billion annually. City government alone makes an enormous investment in the MTA already. This is comprised of $900 million annually in direct funding and a further $900 million in in-kind contributions, including services by the NYPD, homeless outreach efforts, and debt service. This represents a $200 million increase from last year. And in 2015, the city committed $2.5 billion to the MTA capital plan, the largest general capital contribution in history. But it's clear the MTA needs a long-term dedicated revenue source. I have proposed a millionaire's tax to pay for infrastructure and for the Fair Fare initiative, half-priced Metro cards for lower-income New Yorkers. I urge that this proposal be included in the enacted budget. A recent panel report commissioned by the governor proposed a form of congestion pricing that would serve as a dedicated revenue source. I was pleased to see East River Bridge tolls removed and to see the inclusion of block-the-box automated enforcement. I also support the panel's focus on commercial and for-hire vehicles. I urge the legislature to consider expediting a surcharge on for-hire vehicles and an added surcharge on taxis for the MTA. This would even the levels of surcharge on both types of vehicles and address the MTA's immediate budget requests. If there were a congestion pricing plan, there are several measures critical for New York City residents. One, a requirement that all proceeds are invested in mass transit projects in the 5 boroughs only. And 2, the City of New York needs the ability to sign off on transit projects and priorities. Also, any pricing scheme for passenger vehicles should take the needs of New Yorkers with hardships into account, including low-income New Yorkers and those with disabilities. Now I want to focus on some areas of concern when it comes to the MTA in the executive budget. The first is a quote-unquote value capture proposal that would grant the MTA the power to raid our property taxes on properties within a 1-mile radius of certain projects. This proposal would cost billions and blow a hole in the city's budget, forcing us to cut back on essential services like police, sanitation, and education. This should be a concern for every local government. I was encouraged by the governor's recent comments that portrayed this as a choice for the city, not a mandate. I would urge you to remove this provision from the enacted budget altogether. Another MTA proposal in the executive budget that would devastate city finances is the mandate that the city pay all capital costs for the New York City Transit Authority. That means tens of billions of dollars in new capital obligations. And it is based on the false premise that the city is legally responsible for paying the New York City Transit's capital costs. 65 years of statutory provisions, lease agreements, and funding history prove otherwise. I respectfully request that you reject this proposal. Now I'd like to turn to the topic of education. Bringing equity and excellence to the city's school system has been the core mission of my administration. With your help, we're making sweeping reforms designed to ensure every child in every grade in every neighborhood fulfills their potential. These include giving our kids a great start with pre-K, working to bring all students to reading level by 3rd grade, and offering advanced placement courses to all high school students. The proposed $248 million increase in education aid in the executive budget falls short of the increases in previous years and short of what the city needs to continue to bring equity and excellence to our schools. Since 2008, the city's share of education spending has increased to 56% from 49%, while the state share has declined to 36% from 41%. Over 2 years, with your help, we increased the fair student funding average from 88% to 91% by raising it for 787 schools. Today, all community and all renewal schools are at 100%. And I want to note, any school that leaves renewal status remains a community school at the 100% level. But the state campaign for fiscal equity obligation still has not been fulfilled. If the state fulfills its CFE commitment, we will use that funding to get every school to 100% by fiscal '22. Especially problematic in the executive budget is a provision that gives the State Division of Budget a virtual veto on school district spending. This could lead to arbitrary decisions and could jeopardize the equity and excellence vision that we know is working. We join the State Education Department and school districts statewide who are concerned about this measure. And we ask that you do not tie up much-needed resources for our students through added layers of bureaucracy. The executive budget also shifts a variety of charter school costs to New York City alone. In fiscal 19, these costs amount to more than $144 million currently borne by the state. The costs are comprised of $120 million from the elimination of state reimbursement for supplemental basic tuition to charter schools and $24 million from a proposed cap in reimbursement for the rental costs paid to charter schools. The state made a commitment to fund the additional tuition and a portion of the rental support in the past. The state should continue to pay those costs rather than placing an unfunded mandate on the city. The governor's executive budget would also make an arbitrary funding cut of $65 million in fiscal 19 to special education. Last year, this funding supported 200,000 special ed students. And at a time when the city is making significant investments in our child welfare system, the state proposes to cap reimbursements for state child welfare funding. The cap is aimed just at New York City and has a potential impact of $64 million in fiscal 18 and $129 million in fiscal 19. And this would harm our efforts to keep kids with their families and out of foster care. Now I'd like to turn to the homelessness crisis. We've made unprecedented efforts to address homelessness, including access to counsel for all New Yorkers in housing court, outreach to street homeless through Homestat, the most comprehensive outreach program of any major city in the country, and working towards a smaller borough-based shelter system. And we are seeing progress. We have moved 60,000 New Yorkers from shelter to permanent housing. And we know Homestat is working. Since 2015, we have moved nearly 1,500 people off the streets who have not returned to the streets. Rather than proposing to withhold city shelter funding, the state should support our outreach efforts. The state's executive budget also cuts $9 million from the city's rental assistance program for working families, Link 1. This will literally make it harder for 1,800 New Yorkers in shelter to find permanent housing, and I urge the legislature to restore this cut. Before I conclude, there are just a few issues not in the budget that we think deserve your attention. One, design build has accelerated dozens of state infrastructure projects and saved taxpayers billions. New York City's taxpayers deserve the same advantage. Here are two examples of projects that we could complete more quickly and efficiently if we had this design build tool. One, the major rehabilitation of the BQE triple cantilever that 15,000 large trucks pass over on a typical day. And 2, the installation of crucially needed new boilers in public housing developments. While we're on the topic of public housing, my administration came into office dedicated to reversing decades-long disinvestment, and we have made unprecedented investments, including $1.9 billion in capital spending for roof replacement benefiting 179,000 residents, facade repair at 364 buildings, and security improvements at the 15 most dangerous developments that have yielded a much safer environment. This winter, we added $200 million in capital to upgrade heating systems at the 20 developments with the most severe heating problems. This will add up to a total capital investment by the City of New York of $2.1 billion, which is unprecedented in the history of the city. Now I'm asking for your support in matching the city's $200 million investment in heating systems. We're also investing $9 million in capital and $4 million in expense for rapid response teams and mobile boilers to address the immediate heating crisis and to keep our residents warm. In addition to our capital investment in NYCHA, the city has made $1.6 billion in investments in operating expenses. One other important issue that's not in the executive budget, Civil Rights Law Section 50A, which prohibits the disclosure of personnel records of law enforcement and other uniformed personnel without a court order or an employee's written consent. We have introduced a bill that would allow the NYPD to post all pertinent disciplinary information, a summary of the judge's decision, and the police commissioner's final determination on the NYPD website at the conclusion of an administrative disciplinary process. I urge you to support this bill. Finally, I want to mention that the city's critical life-saving speed camera program that you worked so hard to pass expires this year. Let's not just extend it, let's expand it and loosen location restrictions to cover all the streets surrounding our schools. I want to thank you all for what we have done together, for the great work that you have done in support of the people of New York City. I want to thank you for the partnership. And as I begin a new term, I want to say I look forward to 4 more years of working together. Thank you, Madam's Chair.
Thank you, Mayor. Before we move on to questioning, I just wanted to say we've been joined by Assembly Members Delan, Braunstein, Blake, and Aubrey. And now to our city's chair, Assemblyman Benedetto.
Mr. Mayor, good morning, and thank you again for being here. I noticed in your testimony you addressed design build, okay? And you mentioned in your testimony the BQE project, which, as I understand it, and confirm for me if I'm wrong, if it's not done fairly quickly, it just has to begin, and you will not have to have the opportunity to use design build. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yes, we have to move soon on the BQE. It's one of the most vital arteries in the entire city, and that triple cantilever area needs work in the next few years. But unless design build authority is given to the city, we would be doing that work in a much slower and more costly fashion than necessary.
And according to your testimony, you're talking 15,000 large trucks. It's my understanding, without this project getting going, trucks will have to be banned from the BQE. And sent into local streets, causing quite a mess in those streets. Am I correct on that one too?
I think you're correct, and there's no other way to say it, that there's literally no good alternative to the BQE, given the amount of volume it handles, which is crucial for the whole city and state. And if we can't fix it properly, if the work takes a lot longer than it has to, we're talking about all that traffic having to go somewhere. It's either going to congest our highways further, or it's going to end up in some cases on local streets, which is the worst of all situations.
It's going to take a lot longer than it has to. Can you give me an estimate on, without design build, how long it will take, and how long you would take if you do use design build?
I want to be exacting, and I'll check our budget director. Do you have that handy? Otherwise, we will come back with it quickly. We're going to come back with that quickly. We want to make sure we have the accurate number for
And also, the second part of that will be the cost savings. Do we have an estimate on the cost saving using design build?
We will get both the cost savings. I think they're working on it as we speak, Assembly Member.
Lastly, on the design build issue, some of the problems we've had getting design build passed stem from objections from trade unions, objections from women minority-owned businesses not being included. Can you lastly address that issue? What has the city done to make that more palatable, if you would?
Assembly Member, first of all, although I'm familiar with some of the objections, I would say, considering that the state grants itself this own capacity as a matter of consistency, our city is 43% of the state's population. We're obviously one of the engines of the state economy, so I would immediately say if those issues were resolved enough so that the state could give itself the authority, it seems only fair to give the city the authority as well. Obviously, we want to work with the labor community and with minority and women-owned businesses. We have a 30% MWBE procurement goal now in New York City that we are very aggressively pursuing. We've had other instances where we sat down with those constituencies to work out ways to make these new approaches work better for them. I would happily do that. But we have to save the taxpayers a huge amount of money, and we have to speed up our capital projects. There's tremendous frustration when those projects drag on. And I think we can do that while also being fair to labor and to MWBEs. Now, I want to make sure I've got this right. We believe in the case of the BQE cantilever specifically, that design build authority would shave 2 years off the construction of that project. 2 full years, the difference of having the BQE open and fully functional versus shut down in that area. The savings of this one project would be $113 million. For the city as a whole, design build authority could mean many billions of dollars, but this one project, $113 million.
I would think that the taxpayers of the city of New York would be very grateful at saving over $100 million, and in particular, the residents of the areas in Brooklyn that will be inundated with trucks during the course of this construction would be very happy too. Switching to congestion pricing, proposals have been out there about tolling bridges, about doing census just to charge fees going south of 60th Street or so. It's my impression that you are against the first, but seem to accept the second. Can you clarify on that?
I've said consistently that the 2 previous major plans on congested pricing, the one put forward by Mayor Bloomberg, give or take a decade ago, and the one by Move New York, to me did not address core issues of fairness to the outer boroughs and making sure that resources would be appropriately spent in the city and particularly in the outer borough areas that would be bearing the brunt of the cost. This new proposal by the Commission is fundamentally different, and I think better for that reason, because it does not toll the bridges. There are many, many issues that still have to be resolved, and lots of detail we don't have yet in terms of this Commission proposal. My central concern now is that any action taken, any potential action on congestion pricing must include a lockbox for the money to be spent only on New York City subways and buses. Assembly member, you would recognize my concern. You know a lot of the history here, that if there is not such a provision, we will not have an assurance of where that money goes. We will not have an assurance it will solve the problem it is theoretically intended to address. We're also deeply concerned about, if we're going to support anything like that, that there be city sign-off on the things that are being chosen to be priorities for spending. So right now, I've said it's a step in the right direction. It's an improved proposal compared to past proposals, but a lot of unanswered questions, particularly on guarantees on how the money will be spent.
Points well taken. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You mentioned in your testimony in regards to congestion pricing a certain fairness in it and taking the needs of New Yorkers with hardships. One of the items I've been suggesting is possibly a variable rate as opposed to one single charge. So, for instance, people from the outer boroughs or even from upper Manhattan who want to come into the toll district at night after 7 o'clock to go to the theater, to go to the nightlife, on weekends when they want to apprise themselves of the museums and the cultural benefits of New York City, possibly be allowed in those off-peak hours to come in at a reduced rate. Your opinion, sir?
Well, I haven't heard that proposal previously. I think it's a commendable one and one that we'd certainly want to talk to you about. I would also say on the issue of hardship that my concern immediately is for folks who are lower income and may need to use their cars for a variety of reasons, including for medical appointments. We know how much of the medical community is based in Manhattan. I think it's important to be sensitive to that fact. Some people have no choice but to go to those appointments. How are we going to accommodate them and also think about the needs of people with disabilities? So I think the big picture here is your idea and all these other issues have to be addressed, need to be very carefully looked at. For such a proposal to be viable, in my view, it has to address those issues, and most particularly, we have to know where the money is going.
Mr. Mayor, in my closing moments here, I would be remiss if I don't pay attention to some of my local issues, two in particular. The great city of Co-op, okay, a wonderful place to live and a fine example of Mitchell-Lama housing. There is a controversy there about a monopole that is going up.
Excuse me, a what?
I'm told that is the technical term for it, a monopole, a tall structure that holds an outdoor advertising structure. Well, most of these structures are fairly low, 20 feet or so. This one is going to be 260 feet. How could they do this? Because the zoning's never been changed since the existence of Freedom Land, which Co-op City sits on that particular site. And so he's allowed to build 264-foot pole to put this outside neon LED advertising that's going to shine brightly throughout the Bronx, and I guess to notify people flying in planes passing by. If there's anything the city can do to look into that, we would greatly appreciate it, sir.
We will certainly look into it. That is not something I've heard previously, Assembly Member. We'll look into it and get back to you.
There you go. And lastly, look into Ferry Point Park, okay? It needs to be taken care of. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor. Senator Young.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. And our next speaker on the Senate side is our chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Cities, and that's Senator Simcha Felder. Senator?
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
As I look at you, Mr. Mayor, and at your staff, they're saying there's no way he can ask a softball question this morning, and where are his props?
Excuse me, Senator Felder, could you please put 10 minutes on the clock? He is the chairman, he actually gets 10 minutes. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to my defense. I appreciate it. Well, now that I have another 10 minutes,
you can get some props now.
Yeah, I really just wanted to say thank you. An issue that's very personal to me and many of my colleagues, as well as to you, the needs for special needs children and their families. All I can say is thank you, because there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But thanks to you and the angels, I repeat that word, Karen Goldmark doesn't like it, but she, as well as Deputy Mayor Laura Anglin, I've been working with more recently, Sharif Solomon, who've been, I don't want to leave anyone out, but really these are heroes and heroines on behalf of the children and families with special needs. So I can't thank you enough. And thank you, the second thank you was for the commitment to build, work together with me to build a playground. They call it a playground for all children. There's one in Queens, which allows children with disabilities to be able to use you know, they usually don't go to the parks. There's nothing that they can do there. So it's 2 thank yous, and I would request from Senator Young that you owe me 8.5 minutes. Thank you.
Senator, I want to just say thank you for your kind words about the team, but also thank you for having led the charge. That helped all of us to do a better job in terms of making sure we were addressing the needs of our children and their families. You're right, we've still got more to go, but I've talked to a lot of parents, and I know we're making progress, and I've said to everyone, this is about serving each child. It should never have been about saving money, which we all know once upon a time it was. It should be about serving each child. You will see that the amount we're spending on special ed continues to rise, but for a good reason. And all I can say is, in addition to thank you, we would deeply appreciate your help in making sure that the proposed state cuts to special education could be mitigated. Thank you.
Thank you. And as usual, Senator Felder got to the heart of the problem very quickly. So thank you for that.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say ditto to my good friend Simcha Felder's remarks. We've been joined by Crystal People-Stokes, and we moved to Assemblyman Magnarelli, chair of our local governments committee.
Good morning, Mayor.
Morning.
Thank you for coming to the hearing. I just have 2 relatively general questions, but you've given us in your remarks how the executive budget in some respects affects New York City. But what aspects of the executive budget have the largest or the most impact for you in New York City?
What most impact in what sense, Assembly Member?
Well, have they been accounted for in your budget?
Oh, yes. And when we presented our proposal, our preliminary budget, we had the state executive budget to work from. Now, obviously, we know a lot of these issues remain to be resolved, but we treated the proposal from the state as the binding document to begin, and we did include that in our assumptions.
Can you make any kind of a determination on what would be
the overall impact?
Yeah.
It's over $750 million negative, unfortunately. As I mentioned, on the federal side, right now we're looking at, just from what's already happened at the federal level, $700 million, because the DISH program has lapsed and because the tax bill was passed before we even treat the question of the continuing resolutions, and who knows what's going to happen there. On the state side, when you take the immediate cuts, which are approximately $400 million, the different programmatic cuts, when you take the unfunded mandate around Raise the Age, and again, I emphasize how much we agree with this legislature on Raise the Age, but we do believe it's important to be funded. That's about $200 million. So those, in addition to other areas, would take us over $750 million in negative impact.
Okay, but those are federal.
I'm sorry, a state. No, I'm saying in terms of state programmatic cuts, I mentioned the special ed, the child welfare, homelessness. We've got right there $400 million, another $200 million for the cost of having to implement Raise the Age without state support. And again, additional items I could bring forward to you, but the working estimate right now, based on the executive budget from the state, is over $750 million in negative impact on the city budget.
And many of these things, I'm chair of local governments, which would mean all of our communities across the state, but many of our cities are going to be facing the same things. Am I correct? Only in a different proportion.
In terms of impact on the localities?
Yes.
Yes, in some cases, absolutely. In other cases, no. So some of the specific cuts are directed only at New York City. Others are for localities all around the state. So first of all, I would say I'm thinking in terms of the needs of my colleagues all over the state. We think we would all say, every mayor, every town supervisor would say unfunded mandates are dangerous to all of us. But I would also note that some of these are very specific to New York City, even in instances where other jurisdictions receive funding and they were held harmless.
We'll have to look into that. I have a question on education. The executive proposes a change to the reimbursement rates for summer special education funding. How will this impact your ability to provide services and programs to the vulnerable youth that utilize them?
You know, the cut to special education worries us tremendously. I mentioned the fact that it reaches a huge number of children in our city. And per the previous dialogue with Senator Felder, we have struggled for years to finally catch up and handle appropriately the needs of our special education kids. I think in the past, those needs were not given the respect they deserved, again, for cost savings reasons, and I don't believe that was appropriate as a parent, let alone as a public servant. Our point here is the funding that is threatened reaches a huge number of special ed kids, particularly on the services we provide for them during the summer. That continuity is very important for a number of special ed children. And I'm confused why this was singled out for a cut, given that there, I think, is a growing consensus that special education is an area where we all need to do more.
I agree. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And thank you, Assembly Member. Just one clarification. I want to make sure I'm precise, and Simonia rightfully has handed me a helpful note. When we did our budget presentation, we proposed our budget with a clear public acknowledgement of all the threats coming from Washington, all the issues that we're facing in the state budget. We didn't factor in final numbers because, of course, both of those places, the issues have still not been fully rectified. We don't know what's going to happen on those dish payments ultimately, even though right now they've been canceled. Obviously, you all and your colleagues are going to adjudicate the governor's executive budget. So we noted what the impact would be. We did not put it as specific line items yet, but again, that combined potential negative impact is $1.5 billion.
And something you would have to readdress?
Unquestionably, at the time of our executive budget, which comes after the state acts.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going next. So, again, welcome, Mr. Mayor, and I have several topic areas that I'd like to go through today, but first I'd like to start with the property tax cap. And every local government and school district except New York City has been subject to the property tax cap since 2012. And it's been extraordinarily effective in helping taxpayers all around the state, with the exception of New York City. Since the enactment of the cap, property taxes outside of New York City have grown by an average of just 2.2% per year, less than half the average annual growth from 2000 to 2010. So the brakes have been put on those tax hikes. Since the enactment of the cap, New York City's property tax levy has grown at an average of 6.2% per year. Given the significant growth in property taxes, wouldn't New York City residents and businesses benefit from the property tax cap?
Madam Chair, I know you believe deeply in what you're saying, and I also believe deeply it's the wrong direction for New York City. Here's my central argument. First of all, the reason that you see that increase is not because of a rate increase. In fact, in the 4 years of my administration, we have not increased property tax rates, nor will we. And this new budget, once again, does not increase property tax rates. And I am a homeowner myself, and I remember the property tax rate increases of the past, and they're not happening on my watch. Part of that increase that you're talking about is because values have continued to improve in New York City, and as a homeowner, I can say that's a good thing, even though I did not for a moment miss the fact that people have to deal with the challenge of the taxes. But here's where it, in my view, is necessary for us to set the course that we're on now. I'll give you a key example. Working with the City Council, we added 2,000 more police officers on patrol. that was directly a root cause of the fact and a incentive to make the changes that we have made in public safety. Putting those 2,000 more officers on patrol allowed us to implement neighborhood policing and allowed us to create a much stronger counterterrorism capacity. It is one of the reasons we're now the safest big city in America.
But,
My
Mr.
point-
Mayor, I was asking about property taxes, so if we could get back to that. You talk about the fact that values have improved. And so basically what's gone on in the city is that you have not raised taxes per se, but you have increased property values and assessments. And so since the levy has increased by the levy growth factor under the, no, so the levy has increased by $6.8 billion more than it would be if we had imposed a property tax cap. So why wouldn't city residents and businesses want their property taxes to be $6.8 billion lower? And I will remind you of your own testimony today that says there are also negative consequences for our residents' bottom lines. This is your testimony. The new tax law caps the state and local tax deduction and eliminates the personal exemption. That means hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, most earning less than $100,000, will pay more taxes. I commend the governor for trying to find ways to blunt the effects of the new tax law, and I look forward to working with him in the legislature on solutions. So you are saying in your testimony that the new federal tax law hurts property taxes in the city of New York, yet you say that you cannot put in place a property tax cap. Isn't there a disconnect there?
No, we did not choose the new federal tax law. I think it was a huge mistake for the country and for this state. We are going to work with the legislature and the governor to see how we can blunt the impact. I'm very hopeful we can find a way to do that. But, Madam Chair, to my previous point, if we were to pursue the course of action that you recommend, we would not have been able to put those 2,000 more officers on patrol. We would not have been able to make the investments that are working in terms of public safety, education, and a number of other areas. I think it's just a fundamental recognition that New York City is working today. Our economy is working, we're safer, our schools are getting better because we made those investments. If we put a property tax cap on, we would not only not be able to make those investments, we would have to lay off a very large number of public employees who are providing very good service to the people of this city. And we believe that's the wrong direction for our city.
How many billions do you have in a surplus or reserves for the city?
The surplus right now is approximately $5.5 billion. If you combine our general reserve plus our capital stabilization reserve and our employee health benefit reserve. Now that last one I will note is against much, much bigger liabilities going forward.
So you have you really do have quite a surplus, but I want to switch now to school funding and performance. The Senate Finance Committee has been analyzing the governor's proposal, and actually it provides more than 80% of the 2018-19 foundation aid increase to high-need school districts, including New York City. What percentage of the increased Department of Education funding in the city's preliminary budget do you expect would go to individual high-needs districts? We're aware that there are 1,600 individual schools within the New York City system. There are many high-needs school districts. So how much of the budget would you expect to go to those high-needs schools? Because this legislature and the governor have prioritized high-needs schools in the formula, and I'm very hopeful that the city does the same.
We have been prioritizing high-need schools in a number of ways, Madam Chair, and I can get you a breakout of all of them, beginning, with our focus on renewal schools and community schools, continuing with everything we're doing with the pre-K and 3K programs, which disproportionately help high-need schools. The advanced placement initiative disproportionately helps high-need schools. We can aggregate all of those and show you how they affect the higher need schools, but all of this has been about trying to reach a number of schools that bluntly were not invested in the past and now are getting much greater investment because of each of these initiatives.
So the state identifies school districts as high need based on student demographics and local wealth. And how does the city identify individual schools as high need?
I'm not familiar with the specific formula, but I'm happy to get it for you.
If you could get it to us, what factors are used in making the determination? And we also would need how many, approximately how many, or what percentage of city schools do you currently consider to be high need? Do you know?
I'll get that. Make sure we're using the exact numbers with you.
Thank you. Could you provide a list of those schools?
Yes.
That would be very helpful. So, how much funding per pupil does the city currently provide its high needs schools from state and local resources, and how does this compare to its lower needs schools?
Again, Madam Chair, I think the simple way to look at this is that we have been working across the entire school system, 1.1 million plus kids, to improve the schools across the board, every type of school, which is why we have higher graduation rates, higher test scores, et cetera. Our major programmatic thrusts, which have been huge areas of investment, although many of them are universal, like pre-K and 3K, they disproportionately support high-need schools. Certainly, again, renewal schools and community schools do that. We will provide you the breakout of each of those investments and how they affect those schools. But unquestionably, because the Equity and Excellence vision is about addressing the lack of funding in the past to those very schools, we have spent 4 years trying to right that wrong of the past.
So I have a question about why doesn't the Fair Student Funding formula place more of a weighting on poverty?
I'm sorry, I'm not following.
So it's my understanding the Fair Student Funding formula doesn't place a lot of significance or weighting on poverty. Could you please explain that for us?
I'm not sure on that interpretation, so let me see if my colleague wants to jump in or if we need to come back on that.
We need to come back.
We'll come back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. There was recently a Chalkbeat article, and it said that only about 1/5 of the Department of Education's budget is allocated through the Fair Student Funding formula. And if that's the case, why doesn't the city allocate more funding through that formula?
First of all, obviously, we have a huge set of mandates that we operate under, and that's one of the first elements of how we fund, and we have contractual obligations to our workforce. There's a whole set of things that go beyond the question of that formula. But again, it's a question, Madam Chair, of how we change our schools for the better. For example, I believe for decades there was not enough focus on early childhood education. I believe this was a structural problem. This is not something the formula would have addressed. We addressed it on a citywide basis. It's quite clear there were vast inequities between schools. So, for example, some schools had numerous advanced placement courses, others had none whatsoever. This was true for decades. We did not think, and I do not believe, that's something you leave up to individual schools to resolve. That requires a citywide policy to address. We created those policies and we distributed the resources accordingly. The formula is one piece of how we address equity and improve our schools, but there are other pieces as well, and we've made sure to give them substantial support.
Thank you. I came across this article recently. It says, filthy New York City school cafeterias rife with rodents and bugs, from a report. Could you please address that?
I'm sorry, I could not hear that last part.
Filthy, the headline, filthy New York City school cafeterias rife with rodents and bugs, according to a report. Could you please address that situation?
Absolutely. Both my kids went to New York City public schools, and it wasn't that long ago they left, and they spent a lot of time in those cafeterias, so I take very personally the notion that any cafeteria is not up to the health standards it should be. We looked into that. There's definitely work to do. Most of those instances were singular, were addressed immediately. But my mandate to our team is to continue to improve the quality of our cafeterias, and that anything that we need to put resources into to make sure they're healthy and safe, we will do.
I assume that a lot of those schools with the cafeteria problems are high-needs districts or high-needs schools, so I would urge you to make sure that those schools are properly funded. How does the city identify failing or underperforming schools? What metrics do you use?
A number of different metrics: attendance, graduation rates, standardized testing. A host of metrics are looked at, and we believe in multiple measures to determine the status of each school. Obviously, we work with the state education department in terms of determining some of the schools that need particular help. This is work we do constantly, and the goal, of course, is to improve every school regardless of its status.
How many failing schools do we have in the city?
Again, it depends on, there are several definitions out there. The renewal school program has been the central area that we've focused on. I don't, with deepest respect to you, Madam Chair, I don't look at them as failing. I look at them as schools that need to be fixed and weren't invested in the past. That program began with 94 schools, but that number has been declining each year as we have either closed or consolidated some of the schools, or now a number of the schools will graduate out of the program.
Thank you. Question on the failing schools, or the ones that you don't consider to be failing but underperforming. Are they more heavily concentrated in any community, districts, or boroughs?
Are they more
heavily concentrated in any particular community or borough?
They are spread across the city. There's clearly some correlation to where historically there's been underinvestment in communities. There's no question about that. But in the end, it is an individual matter. We have schools literally within a few blocks of each other where one is doing very well and one still needs more work. We have schools that, again, are coming out of that renewal school program with great progress. Others that we have decided are not making enough progress and need to be closed. So yes, of course, there's a broad correlation to less advantaged communities, but it is by no means a broad brush.
Thank you. How many of these schools have been failing for 10 years or more? Because you say that you're taking a lot of action steps, but it's my understanding quite a few have been considered to be failing schools for a long time.
We can give you the updated figures given the ones that we've closed or consolidated or are about to close in June. I don't know the measure because obviously I've only been in office for 4 years, so I don't know what happened in the previous 6 years with each of those schools, but we can give you the profile of them easily.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions about the MTA and NYCHA, but I will come back for round 2. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined on the Assembly side by Assemblyman Skoufis and Assemblyman Weprin, now to Assemblyman Cusick for questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here. Thank you for testifying before this committee every year. It's greatly appreciated by the members here. I want to ask also about the property tax issue. You know, you and I over the years have had this discussion about the property tax cap. You and I disagree on it, but over the years you have said that there will be a comprehensive tax reform plan set forth by your administration, focusing on the assessments. You know, we have a bill in the Assembly that would focus on forming a commission that would look at the process of the assessments. I don't think any of us have residents that don't believe we should pay for services. I think what the gripe is that many folks just want to know what the process is and how their money is being taken and used for these services. And right now, I can tell you from personal experience, there isn't that confidence from the residents that they know how the system works, how they're charged for their taxes. And so I just wanted to ask, are we anywhere closer to this tax reform commission or process that you had set forth last year at this budget hearing?
Absolutely. We've obviously been very focused in the last weeks on preparing the preliminary budget and preparing for this testimony, but certainly very soon we'll have a further announcement on the next steps on property tax reform. It's absolutely needed. I've committed to it. We're going to move on it. We're going to need the help of the legislature and the city council to address it. Assembly member, you know I've had 51 town hall meetings. I think I've been asked a question at 51 of them. No, so
51 times at my town hall.
There you go. And what I've said also is, in addition to creating more transparency and consistency across all 5 boroughs and all neighborhoods, we ultimately have to be roughly revenue neutral to be able to continue providing the support we do. And I think you're right that your constituents and many other constituents don't see yet the kind of consistency and transparency they want. What I hope they are seeing more of is what the impact of the dollars spent is. Certainly, crime reduction, improvements in schools, repaving, I know it's a personal favorite.
Repaving's big, and people do see it, but they do get frustrated because the assessments just went out last month, and I don't know about my colleagues, but the phones in my district office have been all about the increase, what they call the property tax. Right. They don't know the difference, and so that's why I think it's important. I know I don't want you to make news right here, but maybe you can for my sake, but can we get a definite timeline, a date as to when a report will be issued? Because that would make a lot of residents feel a little better about this process.
I'm going to be careful because the day we announce the vision, I want to make sure everything is ready. I can tell you when I say very soon, I mean very soon. It's time to do it. We had to get through the budget process first. So I won't make specific news, but I will tell you it's coming, and it's going to be something that addresses these issues that you and I have discussed. And I would remind you, I understand the frustrations people feel. I assure you, my constituents talk to me about them too at those town hall meetings and many other places. It is because of increase in values in our homes, which per se is a good thing. I understand the challenge that comes with it. At the same time, it's very important that there has not been a rate increase. It's very important that there's no plan for a rate increase. And it's important that compared to the rest of the state, our property tax levels are still much, much lower. The estimate is New York City property tax levels are 3 to 4 times lower proportionally than in the rest of the state, and that's crucial.
I understand that, but most people that we represent don't understand that when the assessment goes up that it isn't a property tax increase. So that's why it's urgent that we do move forward and get this reform going. And I'm glad to hear that it's happening soon. Hopefully soon means this year.
Unquestionably this year.
Okay.
And we were going to need, I want to emphasize, we're definitely getting started this year. We're going to need a lot of work and a lot of help here to act on the elements of the plan we put together. And so our job, I believe my job as mayor, is to bring all the strands together into one final plan with all of the legislative proposal attached to bring here. Obviously, that's when a lot of hard work happens here to go through it and to get to a final outcome.
Great. I see my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Senator Tom Croce and Senator James Tedisco. And our next speaker is Senator Kathy Marchione, who is chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Local Government.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
One of the things you talked about was a goal of reducing your jail population to 5,000. My question is, taken into consideration for those reductions, I hope, is the public safety of letting out people from jail who are there because they've done wrong.
Yes.
And have jeopardized public safety to the rest of your community. So can you tell me about, your goal of letting them out? What about the goal of public safety?
Senator, it's the #1 job of all of us in public life, and I'm very proud of the fact that because of the extraordinary work of the men and women of the NYPD and their community partners, we are literally the safest big city in America. We have brought down major crime categories to the lowest levels since the 1950s. The last time we had this few homicides in New York City was 1951. I mean, it's extraordinary progress has been made, and we intend to continue it. Commissioner O'Neill believes fundamentally that we will continue to reduce crime, while at the same time with new approaches that we find are working very, very effectively. Compared to 4 years previous, in 2017 we had 100,000 fewer arrests, while we had greatly reduced crime at the same time. So we think we can reduce jail population while protecting the people of the city. The vast majority of the problem with reducing jail population is with nonviolent offenders, and the sheer time it takes in the state-governed court system for people to move through their trial process while incarcerated on Rikers Island. Also, the problem that people end up in there because of a bail matter, even though they've done a nonviolent offense. The legislation before the legislature, I know there's different versions, but all aiming at the same goals of speedier trials and reducing the burden of bail. That alone would have a hugely positive impact in our efforts to close Rikers Island.
Okay.
But we believe would not compromise public safety at all.
Okay, I'm limited to on time, so I have a number of questions for you. If that's the case, you've increased your NYPD by 2,000.
2,000 officers on patrol, yeah.
Additional officers if crime is going down. And our governor has found it necessary to send many New York State troopers from their upstate post to New York City. Can you tell me why, if your crime is going down, why these measures are necessary?
Well, obviously, Senator, I say it with deepest respect to the question and to the governor, that is a question for the governor. Those decisions that he has made and the state police have made are theirs. Sometimes they've been matters that have been discussed with NYPD, other times not. I think, of course, the question is where are there areas of sensitivity, particularly in terms of anti-terror efforts. Some of those targets obviously are in the city, and that would be a logical area to reinforce. But I am clear about the fact and respect the fact that there's only so many resources to go around, and there's huge areas of the state that need that help and coverage too. So we feel very confident in the efforts of the NYPD to protect our city. We're very sensitive on anti-terrorism, and obviously we do need some partnership with the state, but I can't answer the rationale for all of those actions.
So you believe you have enough of your own police force to be able to handle New York City pretty much on your own?
Unquestionably, there are, again, some areas where we do not have jurisdiction. The airports and the railroad stations are obvious examples that we assist with, and we're happy to assist with in every way. Those areas cannot be uncovered. Senator, I know you'd agree with that. They cannot be uncovered, and we don't have jurisdiction to provide the ongoing protection. With those exceptions put aside, if you're talking about New York City as a whole, I have total confidence in NYPD's ability to protect New York City.
Thank you. I noticed in your testimony, which I thought was very interesting, there's a heroin epidemic throughout the country, yet your testimony is silent on heroin. Do you believe that the monies that you're receiving from the state are wholly adequate for the heroin epidemic, for you to be able to fight the heroin epidemic in New York City?
It's a major priority in New York City. We've had absolutely borne the brunt of the opioid epidemic, as have many parts of the country. In fact, not only have we made major new investments, whether it's on the policing side or the treatment side or the prevention side of the equation, we announced recently a lawsuit against the opioid makers and distributors, hoping to achieve damages, money damages that will allow us to put more money into prevention and treatment. There's endless need. Very good question, Senator. It's not for lack of interest. It was in the interest of brevity, and also, honestly, that we're trying to focus on the areas that I believe are most problematic in the state budget that we're asking for your help in addressing, where there's specific cuts, and focusing on the area of education, where we see this change in the funding that we think has a huge impact. We absolutely could use more state support to address the opioid epidemic. But we are going to, in the meantime, do everything we can with city resources to fight the problem.
Okay, because I know upstate, that's a very serious issue, is funding relative to being able to help our residents.
And one other thing, I'm sorry, Senator, to interrupt. When we composited recently, when we announced the lawsuit, we checked all spending we were doing annually related to opioids. It's over $500 million when you include policing, jails, treatment by our Health and Hospitals Corporation, and other matters. Right now, the city's spending over $500 million, so you can imagine what a strain that is, and obviously we would appreciate more support.
Also, you said in your testimony, I'm just interested in this myself, that you are going to, everyone who leaves jail following a city sentence will be offered a transitional job. where are they offered a job and for what's the length of time?
My memory is it's a 3-month transitional job. And this is for folks who have been sentenced. So on our jail system, a number of people are awaiting trial. And then there's a small but meaningful number of people who have been sentenced to less than a year. That's the requirement to be in city jails. If you've been sentenced, it can only be up to a year. After that, you'd have to be in a state prison if it were a higher sentence. For those folks sentenced less than a year, by definition, they have done lesser offenses and nonviolent offenses. We offer them, working with a number of nonprofit organizations, an opportunity to have a work experience immediately out of jail, because we want to get them refocused on work, refocused on being a part of mainstream society. Also, the chances of getting a job after that are greatly magnified if someone can apply for a job while having one. And we believe this investment will greatly reduce recidivism, helping us to bring down the jail population, also saving the taxpayers a lot of money.
No, it sounds like a good program. I just wondered whether they were going on the city payroll afterwards, but you've answered that. You said no, they're on not for profits. One other thing, and I have a few minutes left. You talked about wanting to have early voting. Every statistic that I've seen, and perhaps you could share your statistics with me, state that early voting doesn't really give a lot of any additional voting, but it does come with a price tag. And I'm surprised that your testimony didn't request that the state provide the additional funds, as that is also an unfunded mandate. And I've heard throughout the testimony, and I understand, I'm a local government person myself for over 30 years, I get those unfunded mandates. I'm just surprised, Mayor, that you weren't concerned about this being an unfunded mandate.
It's a very fair point, Senator, and honestly, my fervor to get the reform comes first in this case. I'm very quick to note when there is an unfunded mandate, but I think on a basic matter of democracy, before we even talk about how to pay for it, the most important point is making it easier for people to participate. To think that there's 2 million people in our state who are not participating, who are eligible right this moment, not even registered, and we know that is directly connected to how difficult it is to vote. We see much better participation levels in states that have early voting, for example, and same-day registration. So honestly, to me, it's not first and foremost a financial issue. It's a more a question of helping to strengthen our democracy.
Thank you. I'd appreciate those statistics if you have them, because
We'll get those for you.
I have statistics that prove otherwise. But thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Castorina.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Always appreciate you coming up here, and appreciated your testimony today. I have a couple of questions. I'll be brief. The Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created an unanticipated tax revenue windfall for New York if New York State does not decouple portions of our tax code from the federal tax law. Specifically, taxpayers would see a $1.5 billion tax increase on their state personal income taxes. How does New York State, conforming to federal tax law, impact New York City's income tax receipts? And also, New York City would see additional income tax revenue if the state doesn't change the law. What are you estimating that these receipts will be?
Well, we actually looked at this. I appreciate the question very much, Assembly Member. We looked at this a little differently. We believed that that burden placed on our taxpayers by ending the deductibility, which, as you know, has been in place since 1913, we believed it was a huge mistake, and decided not to recognize that new revenue. So you do not see it in our preliminary budget, because it's our intention to work with the state to find a way to blunt the impact and hopefully allow people to not pay a higher level than they would have had deductibility still been there. So we do not note it as new revenue. We believe fundamentally that if we all work together, we can find a way to protect those taxpayers, and then there would not be new revenue.
Mr. Mayor, just want to make a statement real briefly. In fairness to the millions of people that are now seeing more money in their paycheck, their take-home pay, I don't necessarily believe that they would feel that it's a mistake.
Well, I'm sorry, just to be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt. On that one piece, I mean, I think it's strongly believed, this is a bipartisan consensus in this state, that the loss of deductibility was a mistake. We can debate the other fine points of the bill, but I would argue that one's been a bipartisan consensus in New York State.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Before we move to the Senate, just wanted to note that the Speaker Hasty is keeping an eye on our proceedings from the corner there.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the ranking member.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Good to see you.
Oh. Okay. Our next Senate speaker is Senator Roxanne Persaud, who is ranking member on the Cities Committee.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. It's always great to see you here in Albany and in the district. You were in my district a couple of days ago talking about 3K for all. I appreciate what you're doing for the kids in Brownsville in particular. You talked about Crossroads and Ella McQueen. I just want to touch on that.
Yes.
There's the concern in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, that with your intention to open Ella McQueen and expand Crossroads, at the same time you're closing, DOE is proposing to close the only high school in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. The people in Brownsville don't feel that should be. If you're looking at the criminal element while taking away the only high school. So we met with your staff last week, and we were asking you to look at that, because I don't think while you're looking to open criminal justice centers,
yes,
one is just 2 blocks away from the only high school, and the other is 6 blocks away.
Senator,
so I just need you to look into that.
if I may say, when you're right, you're right. We believe that plan that we originally put forward related to the school, which was based on some real solid numerical challenges that we're seeing in that school. But we believe the community leaders, yourself included, raised very good points about ways that we could approach the situation. So we're going to put that original plan on pause, restart with the community, and see what we can do to strengthen that school and move forward for another year with that school and see if we can give it a deeper turnaround. As you know, the vision of the Renewal School program was to invest heavily for 3 years, and we've seen some that we do not believe can be turned around, that we are closing, or some that we already closed or merged. This school had a mix of results, but there were real concerns. The community's raised excellent points that we want to honor by adding a year and adding some additional investment and seeing if we can get it to be sustainable on a long-term basis.
Thank you. I also want to commend you and NYPD for your emphasis on community policing, and when we're talking about New York City being the safest city it's been in a number of years, I appreciate that, and I hope that the precincts, I cover 7 precincts, will be allocated the resources they need to continue to fight crime, and so that we are going to continue talking about the decrease in crime for many, many years to come. I also want to talk about EMTA. As you know, and the people of Canarsie have presented you with, fabulous folder of signatures.
Very large number of signatures.
Very large number of signatures.
I remember.
We're committed to that. With the closure of the Canarsie Tube for the rebuilding, and the L train, there'll be less L train service for the people of Canarsie and other areas. We're hoping that you will look into bringing the ferry service to Canarsie. As you know, the ferry service has been very successful in the areas that you've opened it. You reached the 1 million rider threshold faster than anyone anticipated. Can we count on your commitment to really looking into bringing the ferry service to that area of Brooklyn? Because it will be the only other alternative that we have.
So, Senator, just a quick framing on this. The initial ferry expansion will go into the summer when we're going to add a line in Soundview in the Bronx, and we're going to add another line on the east side of Manhattan. Then, once those are all in place, I've said very publicly, we will make the decisions on the next potential set of lines. Now, we have real budgetary matters we have to look at. It's very much caught up in what happens here with the state budget and what happens in Washington. But there's been a number of nominations, certainly Staten Island, Southern Brooklyn, Northeastern Queens, a number of places have said, please consider ferry service for us. So this summer, we're going to come back with an answer once we've seen what happens on the budget front. The second point I make is where there's exceptional situations like the L train closure, I think you make a good point. We need to look at that as a particular need for a particular period of time, and we will do that as well. I'm not going to commit yet, but we're going to certainly put that into the calculation as a major factor that has to be considered for the people of Canarsie.
Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Maliotakis.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. It's so nice to be able to ask you a question without Bo Dietl interrupting.
Yes, you know, we're so much civil when it's just us together, you know.
With regards to the property taxes that we were discussing here today, and I add my voice to those of my colleagues that when we talk about the increase in spending that the city has put forth from $70 billion roughly in the last year of Mayor Bloomberg to now we're looking at over $88 billion. That's putting a tremendous burden on property taxes, and as you know, a third roughly of the city's revenue comes from that. But to highlight some of the inequities, I happen to bring my property tax bill. I happen to bring yours as well. But the point—
How convenient.
You have to have exhibits, right?
Yeah.
Mine, $559,000 home. I pay roughly $5,400 in property taxes. You have a $1.6 million home. You pay roughly $3,500 in property taxes. So I am paying $2,000 more for a home that's valued at about a third. And that is really what this issue is about. It's the inequity of the effective tax rate, where, for example, in your district, which you pay the least effective tax rate, it's 1.05%. And unfortunately for me, in my district, my council district, I pay the highest at 1.05%. You pay the least at 0.33%. So that is why the Property Tax Commission is so important. I'm glad that over the summer you've agreed to do that. I've offered my assistance in any way I can to support this because I think it is something for all of our constituents that is very important. My question is regarding the property tax levy. You've testified here today that the tax rate has not gone up, and it hasn't gone up, and I agree with you there. However, what has gone up is the property tax levy, which is what you as mayor and the city council members have control over. And so in 2015, that levy went up 6.14%. In 2016, it went up 6.88%. In 2017, it went up 6.83%. In 2018, it's 7.49%. Now, you as the mayor and the city council members have control over that levy, and why do you keep increasing it every year, and what can we anticipate for the fiscal year 2019? Because cumulatively, it has gone up over the last 4 years, 37.71%, which is an additional $7 billion on property tax homeowners, and that is something I think that is upsetting to a lot of people across the city, particularly those who are paying that higher effective tax rate, such as those in my district.
Assemblymember, let's break that into a couple of quick pieces. The inconsistency among neighborhoods makes no sense, has to be addressed. It's something about our current tax law that doesn't account for the reality of our lives today. And that's why we will have a process very soon, and we will need your help. And I appreciated your offer to help. I will certainly take you up on that because we have to get to a more consistent and transparent system. I've tried to be honest with people, and I find that New Yorkers appreciate blunt honesty. And again, I've said it at 51 town hall meetings. I've explained, first of all, this is based on rising property values, which none of us like the tax impact, but we do appreciate when our property values go up. And second, that our property tax levels are proportionally much lower than the rest of the state. But really it comes down to what are we providing people for the money that they are contributing? And I have to tell you, a lot of that, you're right, there's been a substantial increase in the budget. One of the reasons why was at the end of the Bloomberg administration, none of our city workforce, pushing on towards almost 400,000 people, none of them were under contract. Some of them had years and years when they weren't under contract previous. All of that had to be accounted for. So we were all left to make up for that, which we've done now. But that did increase the budget greatly.
And I appreciate that. I'm sure if you and I both sat down with the budget, I'm sure there'll be differences in what we would like to eliminate or what we'd like to add. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the city, as well as the state, needs to live within its means. And the issue here is that the levy, which the city, without a property tax commission, without any action from the state, you and the city council alone have control over that property tax levy. And you've chosen to increase it year after year to a point where it's a cumulative increase of 37%. That's $7 billion more that we're seeking from the taxpayers. So I ask if you would consider freezing that levy, or at least a cap, which has been suggested here, and we've, of course, have legislation which you've opposed, unfortunately. But I really think, at least for a year, can you look at perhaps capping that levy to a reasonable rate to give until we complete this commission study and find a better solution to revise what has been an outdated law. We both agree, 1981, it's outdated. Housing stock has changed. Times have changed. But we do need some type of relief until that commission is in place. And I think by freezing or capping the property tax levy, that's the way to do it for now. Thank you.
I respect the question. Obviously, I respect the idea you're putting forward. I don't agree. And the reason is that my job is to protect the safety of the people of this city. My job is to make sure schools are getting better, roads are being paved, everything we're doing. People demand those services rightfully. And if we're going to look at the overall dynamics of property tax, we should do it all of a piece. We should put all the pieces together and do it properly. So that's how I believe is the right way to proceed. Again, people very much, when I talk to them about the specific things we could not do if we changed our approach to property tax, consistently I hear from my constituents, they do not want us to cut back on the services we provide to the people of the city. In fact, wherever I go, and I know you both would agree with me, you've been at the same town hall meetings, people are demanding more services. So I would argue the right way to approach this is with an overall effort to reform the property tax system.
Well, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Senator Brian Benjamin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here this morning. I want to start off with Rikers Island. First, I want to thank you for your specificity in your testimony in regards to some of the things that need to be done to reduce the population. I have a few questions. First, how many state parolees are currently housed in Rikers Island for technical violations?
I have to get you the exact number. The state parolees, oh wait, I've been handed the exact number. Look at that.
Fantastic.
630 on an average day.
Okay.
So let's clarify this, that these are, because parole is handled by the state systematically, the parole violation under the state domain still ends up with the individual being in the city jail. We're saying if the state were to take responsibility for those 630 people on an average day, relevant to the state's own parole program, that would reduce Rikers' population about 15%.
Gotcha.
Just that one action.
Okay. Second question is, if was anything missing? I mean, I know sometimes you have to truncate these testimonies, but is there anything missing in terms of ideas that you have that the state can do in addition to all these other ones that you've provided to us this morning?
Well, these, Senator, would be hugely important. I mean, the number one would be the bail reform and
speedy trial.
Yeah, the speedy trial. I mean, right there, you're talking about shaving off a substantial amount of time in our effort to close Rikers. I don't think there's any one factor more important than that. So literally, for those, and I know you're one of them, passionately want us to see the speediest possible timeline. I've said we've had detailed conversations. I want the speediest possible timeline too, but I'm always going to be blunt and honest with the people about what we see it as at this moment. If this legislature were to pass bail reform and speedy trial, it would be the single biggest factor in reducing the timeline for closing Rikers, unquestionably. But obviously, the parolee issue is a very big deal and would be a very helpful piece of the equation. And we will continue to delineate. I mean, right now, the state has facilities in the city. We would like to be able to work with the state on those facilities more productively. There's many things we could do, but number one is the legislation.
Sure. So let me just ask, as you know, you have proposed closing Rikers in 10 years or committed to that.
Yes.
I have introduced a piece of legislation to close Rikers in 3 years. Obviously, there's a time delta between the two of us. My question for you is, let's imagine a world where we were able to pass every single thing you've asked for in this testimony, including design bill. What would you say would be a reasonable timetable, assuming all this gets passed, that we can close Rikers? I would imagine it would be less than 10 years.
There's unquestionably it'd be less than 10 years.
Okay.
So
you have a sense of timing of what you think?
Well, let me give you a few points very quickly. I mean, you're talking about now major structural change that we would love and we would appreciate and it would make a huge difference. Design build that we can't do on our own.
Right.
The parolees we can't do on our own. Speedy trial we can't do on our own. Bail reform we can't do on our own. If you did the whole package, you're immediately talking about taking years off the process.
Any sense of years?
I want to be careful because I want to do the math with the team and come back with something very specific. Unquestionably, multiple years. And that's huge in this process. We are aggressively moving with the City Council on the land use process to create the 4 new facilities. Land use process, you know plenty about it.
Yes.
Right there, that books in a certain amount of time, and then construction books in a certain amount of time. But those pieces are going to move as aggressively as allowed under the law. That alone, we know that's the physical requirement, and honestly, that is more than 3 years just because we know what it takes to build major buildings in New York City, even under the most expedited timelines. But if the state would act on all those pieces, it would be a game changer, and at minimum take off several years, and I can come back with you on what exactly we would project.
So possibly 5.
I don't want to, again, I want to be careful not to put words in my own mouth.
I understand. All right,
years, plural, unquestionably.
Gotcha. So I got a quick question on education. So one of the schools in my district, Wadley Secondary School, runs from 6 to 12.
Which one, sir?
Wadley Secondary
yes.
School.
Yes,
it is
I know
a
it.
community,
I've been there.
Yes, it's a renewal school, and it's getting all the fair state funding. Unfortunately, in the 6th to 8th grade levels, proficiency in reading and math have not improved over the years. So 2 questions to that. Number one is, if you notice, particularly in these schools that get this extra funding, if you notice that there's not performance, who's held accountable, I guess? I mean, at what point do you say, listen, this superintendent or this principal is not performing and they need to be removed or terminated or some new thing has to come into place? That's number one. Second thing is, as you look for a new school's chancellor, how are you taking into consideration their focus on issues like student performance and making sure that as we do things like community renewal schools, which I totally agree with, that there is some sort of accountability as it relates to schools that have been chronically underperforming?
That's an excellent question. So will certainly be and has been a major factor in how we choose a new chancellor. I'm convinced the renewal initiative was the right thing to do. And we said from the beginning, we believed a number of schools could graduate, and we're seeing that now. We believe some other schools, given enough work and investment, it might take a little longer, but can get there. We believe that's playing out. But from the beginning, we also said, if you make that kind of investment in a concentrated way and a school doesn't come around, some just don't have the capacity to improve past a point, then we'll close them or we'll merge them, which we've been doing.
But how do you know if it's an issue between the school or the leadership? How do you decide what's the...
No, it's an excellent point, and I've talked to the chancellor case by case in a number of situations about each school and what we assessed. In some cases, we did feel that there was a leadership problem. In other cases, we did not. Many times you've seen with the renewal schools a change of leadership. And many times that you've seen also a deep superintendent involvement. A superintendent typically has many, many schools they cover in a district. So a single historically troubled school not turning around as quickly as we want, I'm not sure that would be the only way we think about that superintendent, but that superintendent clearly bears some responsibility. But most especially, we look at the principal. Some principals have done an outstanding job turning around troubled schools. Others have not. There's been some major personnel changes. The end of the day, we're going to look at all of it. We're not afraid to make those personnel changes. We've made a lot of them. As you know, right down to the level of teachers. Since I came into office, we've helped over 2,000 teachers to find a different profession because they were not doing as well as we would have liked for our kids. So it's always factored in. In the case of Wadley, I know the history. We think pieces of that program are viable long-term. Other things need to change. We'll have more to say on that soon, but that's one I've definitely been directly involved with.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, our Education Chair, Kathy Nolan.
Thank you, Madam Chair and colleagues. It's been a continual struggle in all the years that I'm up here to remind members that, and the folk that we educate over several million children in our state, the vast majority in public school, but over 1 million of them are in the city of New York. The next largest school district, Buffalo, is a little over 30,000. Most school districts of the close to 700 in our state educate about 5,000, many of them about 5,000. I had more people at my high school. We had 6,000 in the high school I attended. So the scale of the city schools and the more children go to school in trailers in New York City than in many of the, for example, the size of many of the school districts on, say, Long Island. So the challenges for the city are very, very great. And in all the years I'm here, it's only in recent years that the state has really come close to doing its proper share of funding. So what I would like the mayor to talk a little bit about is the role that foundation aid plays in writing that balance, in addressing those problems. I would also point out some of the comments today. We've worked very closely on things like a cafeteria bill. The information in some of that story came out of a bill that we worked on under your leadership so that parents would have more information. The same with renewal schools, the same with the reauthorization of mayoral control last year. There is a vast and overwhelming amount of information available about every city school online, very easily available. One of the advantages of mayoral control in the last 15 years has been the centralization of that information. When I started, you could not get that information. Now that information is available. But the main thrust of this hearing for me, and all the hearings that I've attended under 5 mayors, is to get, obviously as chair of education, I want to have a statewide focus. I want the formula to reflect the neediest kids, the special ed kids. But I also, as someone from Queens, we haven't even had anybody from Queens talk yet, so I want to make sure I make the local shout out. But I think as someone from the city and a longtime observer of the Albany scene, we have over 1 million children, and we have never really gotten what I believe they should get. So the role of foundation aid and the Campaign for Fiscal Equity was critical in starting to reverse that dynamic, but I would like you to address it a little more. There's only a sentence in the testimony, and talk a little bit more about what this budget does that might hurt city schools, because in the past, we've had a few opportunities, unfortunately, compromises that go on up here, and I felt that city schools were unfairly hurt. So I would like to hear you talk a little bit about that, and talk a little bit more about the 1 million students that attend school in New York City, and then remind people that the next largest district is 30,000, and most districts are much smaller than that.
You're absolutely right, Assembly Member, and in fact, there are more kids in New York City public schools than there are people in some states of the Union. That's the sheer magnitude of it. There was historic underinvestment in our schools. The Campaign for Fiscal Equity case was decided by the Court of Appeals. It wasn't gray. It was a clear decision mandating the state, not just for the city of New York, but for other cities around the state and for rural areas as well that were not getting their fair share. I would argue that not only do we have a legal obligation as a state to live up to the CFE decision, but also in terms of preparing our kids for the 21st century, it's the best investment we're going to make for the future of our state. What does it mean in terms of the city, as you asked? Well, first of all, you're right. There's a huge amount of information we put forward. This is an advantage of mayoral control. Everything is concentrated and focused. There's one person held accountable, that's me, and we provide a huge amount of information to the state and publicly available online about all that we're doing. On what we would do if we were getting the levels of funding mandated under the CFE decision, we would address the fair funding formula immediately. That would be one of the most important priorities that we would have. If we saw the kind of increases that were mandated under the CFE decision, we would close that gap on fair funding. We'd be able to do that in just a few years and be done for every school would be at the 100% level. And I know there's a lot of passion on that issue amongst your colleagues. Help us to get there. The gap that you asked about right now is over $200 million compared to what we expected just based on recent years' funding, not even compared to what it would be if CFE were fully implemented. So if we could get back to the kind of funding we saw in previous years, we would immediately invest that in addressing fair funding. If we got to the levels mandated by CFE, we could wipe out the gap and have all schools funded at the 100% level.
And then the proposals on some of the charter school funding, how does that hurt the city of New York?
It hurts us because it is the epitome of an unfunded mandate. This is money that was mandated by the state, but that the state used to contribute toward. Now the state is backing away from the contribution while raising the requirements under the mandate. So you heard the numbers I referred to. This is becoming very, very substantial money. And this is not, the city certainly didn't ask for these additional mandates, but if the state wants to put them on, then it's incumbent, in my view, on the state to add the funding to go with it. Hundreds of millions of dollars. By the way, again, if you're talking about a devotion to addressing fair funding, then get rid of that unfunded mandate, and that's another way that would help us continue to make efforts on fair funding.
Thank you.
Senator Hannan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate your patience and your articulate presentation. I noticed in your written testimony you made scant mention of the healthcare system in New York City, mentioning only an Obama-era change in disproportionate share payments. But I would like to know what the city is doing and as a commitment to moving forward with now H+H, because those hospitals form a core of healthcare in the city, and it has not been objectively sustained in the past few years. Not just your administration, but your obligation really now and going forward.
Senator, I appreciate the question very much, and thank you for your kind comment. I would say this. You're absolutely right that we need to put our public hospitals on a sustainable footing. Our new president of our public hospitals of H&H has immediately taken the reins with the goal of taking the transformation plan that's been begun and deepening it. We've said very clearly we'll make major cost reductions through attrition, that we have to update the entire apparatus. We have to make it more appealing to a larger customer base. I've been clear about the things we won't do. We're not going to close major facilities. We're going to repurpose them because we think there's a tremendous amount of need that we can address in a smarter way. We're not doing layoffs of members of labor unions who have been serving the city, but we are transferring people, retraining people. We're doing a number of other things to reduce costs. But it could never...
Have you made that in terms of a timetable? Is there an announced program to do
Yes.
that? I've heard the same thing when you had the prior head of H+H come in, and then he left when apparently none of that was able to be done.
Well, no, I would say, Senator, I would argue that he did make, Mr. Raju made major reforms that helped us to create more of a pathway to sustainability. And, a few years ago, the city had to put very substantial resources in just for the solvency of health and hospitals. We have not had to do that this year. The financial situation has stabilized. The danger now, the biggest danger, is what will happen with the dish payments, first and foremost, and then any potential danger in terms of Medicaid cuts up ahead from the federal government. But if those problems can be averted, we're in a much more stable place because we did a lot of attrition. I will say under Mr. Raju, and then under the interim leader, Stan Brezhnev, we moved out a lot of personnel to reduce costs, and we began a lot of the restructuring. Mitch Katz is now going to take it to the next level, and you're going to see additional restructuring. But we have no illusion, Senator, that the previous way of doing things was acceptable. It was not sustainable. Your word is the exact right word. We're making major changes.
We agree. Maybe we don't agree in the next topic, which is getting the subways to run. In your testimony, you talked about trying to say that you don't have capital obligation commitments from the city of New York, and you go through the long history. Well, I've gone through that history also, and I think the city does have capital obligations, as well as has obligations to what we're trying to do for operating expenses. And I really have to disagree with your statement in your testimony that you don't have the capital obligations. Mr. LaHoda has pointed out you still own the subway, even though it's operated by the MTA under lease. But we need to get a commitment out of this going forward. I have constituents, we're probably out of the outer boroughs, out in the Long Island, but they depend on the subway as much as anybody else who uses it. And you made in your own testimony, you said 70% of the riders are New York City residents. Well, we got the other 30%, and they count on it too.
I absolutely agree with that point, and we want to make sure that there's a fair resolution for the subway situation. Now, that 70% I referred to is where all the revenue is coming from. New York City taxpayers and New York City government making contributions right now. And I remind you of the $2.5 billion that we added in capital, not because we had a legal mandate. We did not. We made a choice to do that. Look, I would argue, Senator, that we saw an evolution over 65 years that regardless of the underlying ownership structure, what's happened is the state of New York has come to control the MTA, the decision-making, the budget, all elements of the MTA reality. We are willing to work as we do very productively in some areas. For example, select bus service has been a collaboration between the city and the MTA. We both fund it. It's been very effective. But that's been where there's been a fair decision-making process and specific goals we've agreed to. But we do not agree.
My point is, when it came to redoing subway stations, you guys were going to veto it, and you got the MTA to delay it. That shows that you have a certain amount of power there, like a vote, and you can control these things if you want. But it's not so much the legal obligation, which I would contend in the middle of it, we had to change because the city almost went bankrupt in the 70s. Had to change. So we've continued from there. But I think it's more of the policy obligation that the city and the state faces to make sure the system works so we can maintain a great viability in the economy. And I don't find the mutual commitment to that that's necessary.
Senator, let me, with all due respect to the point you made about that specific vote, where we were in the minority, but we believe that the plan that was offered did not address the essential problem, which is the subways not running on time and not being reliable.
I think you had the veto power. Is that
Again,
not correct?
on that vote, we were in the minority. We stayed a position which I stand by, that the spending by the MTA should focus on the fundamental operations of the subways, not the platforms, not other extraneous matters, but getting the subways to work on time. We do not have a controlling vote on that board. The fact is, we've made major contributions. We put a lot of money into the MTA right now, directly from the city government, and also through our taxpayers and our residents. We made that capital contribution. But the notion that the overall capital costs would suddenly be foisted on the city, and the state continues to control the MTA apparatus, that is a fact. Mr. Loda was appointed by the governor. That's abundantly clear.
Mr. Mayor, we have a $30 billion capital program. The state's putting in about 30%, the city's putting in about 9%. I think the difference, the disparity is enormous. I think it's not so much the numbers, though. It's the commitment to do it, improve the system, make it move forward, so we don't have a summer of hell.
Senator, again, Your arguments are, I respect them. I understand the logic. I only ask that you hear my logic. One, 65 years of experience tells us the truth. The city is not legally responsible for those capital costs. We are responsible for education, public safety, sanitation, a whole host of things, but we're not responsible for the capital costs of the MTA. Second, we are very concerned about the outcome. We would like to see a good outcome. We have contributed previously voluntarily. That's what that $2.5 billion, that was not based on any specific legal requirement. We did that. We did that because we thought it was a fair situation to contribute to. But now that we're talking about the long-term needs of this agency, again, we may disagree, but we've put forward, I've certainly supported with a number of members of the House, excuse me, of the Assembly and the Senate, have supported the notion of a millionaire's tax with the fair fare attached as the best way to move forward. Others disagree. We are going to work with this legislature very collegially toward whatever is the right long-term solution, but there must be, I believe, at the end of this session, a long-term funding mechanism for the MTA. That's in all of our interests. But that does not answer the fundamental question of how decisions are currently made in the MTA. The City of New York does not. There may be a few narrow areas where we structurally have some power, but in terms of the MTA board, ultimately, we don't. We don't decide the budget, we don't decide the leadership, we don't decide the direction, we don't decide the spending priorities. So I would just caution that I think that those realities are quite clear, but of course we want to be at the table with you to determine a solution. We absolutely want a solution, and it must be a long-term funding mechanism.
Then you're going to need suggestions, and not the millionaire's tax, which probably isn't even alive on arrival, being dead at the beginning. So we need many more suggestions than we've heard.
And we, my team and I will sit at the table with members of the legislature throughout this session, because I would argue by June 30, this issue has to be resolved for the long term for all of us, and we will work with the legislature, both houses, Democrat and Republican alike, to help achieve that solution. Absolutely ready to do that. I remind you, in the proposal on the millionaire's tax, I understand ideologically there are some real differences potentially, but I do want to say, working with members of the Senate Assembly, we did structure it just to be directed at New York City residents to try and respect the fact that it's a New York City problem. We're looking for New York City resources to solve the problem in that case through taxation. But if that is not what ultimately is going to win the day, we will work with this legislature on other options. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblywoman Wallace and Assemblyman Dan Steck, and to Assemblyman Buchwald for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here as always. A week and a half ago at one of these hearings, I gave MTA Chairman Joe Loda an opportunity to interpret some of your remarks, and you'll be happy to learn that he passed on the opportunity. But I'd like to
He's a gentleman.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I'd like to ask you the question directly. Mr. Mayor, you've urged, including today, that assurances be given that revenues raised through any Manhattan car pricing zone go to New York City subways and buses. Can you help the state legislature to understand the implications of that request? Are you saying that the money collected from transportation needs to be dedicated to transportation, which is a principle I very much agree with? Are you saying that you're opposed to even a small percentage of funding going to the roads and bridges of New York City? Or are you saying that you are opposed to any of the new revenue going to the MTA's commuter railroads, despite the fact that a significant percentage of the money raised will come from residents of the suburbs of New York City, and the fact that the better the service on Long Island Railroad and Metro-North Railroad, the less congestion there will be in New York Central Business District?
Assembly member, I understand the arguments you make, of course, but I would like to refer to the point that the senator made before, that folks who come into the city from the suburban counties, and we value them, we appreciate them, all they do for the city, and we think the city does a lot for the metropolitan area. We're all in this together. But they depend on our buses and subways every single day as well. I would argue that the money raised should be singularly focused on buses and subways. And the reason I'd argue that, we have tremendous other needs infrastructure-wise. The City of New York is putting a huge commitment into our roads and bridges. We have, I think the fact is, over 100 bridges that are over 100 years old in New York City. So we have massive infrastructure needs. Our hope and prayer is to address that through eventually some kind of bigger federal infrastructure plan. I think it's the only way viable to do that on a sustainable basis. But in terms of the needs of the MTA, which I think is core to the future of the city and the state, we've got to fix this system once and for all. And we only do that with a consistent revenue infusion and a focus on the fundamentals, the signals, the electronics, the basics that allow the subway system to run. That's where the money needs to go. And look, we also know there are parts of the outer boroughs that are still profoundly underserved by mass transit. We can't be a functioning city of, right now, almost 8.6 million, on the way to 9 million as early as 2030. We can't function if we don't spread the mass transit more widely. So I would argue that is the fair way to approach it, and that will also benefit a number of suburbanites as well.
Mr. Mayor, I appreciate those remarks. Obviously, I think I'm arguing for it to be spread more widely, of course, as well. And if I were to concede the point, which is no doubt true, that suburbanites make use of the subways and buses in New York City, would you also be willing to concede the point that New York City residents make use of the commuter railroads as well, not least to reverse commute, but also to travel within the city, but also that New York City businesses, of course, are also reliant on having folks use the commuter railroads to get to their places of employment?
I would concede the fact while noting a matter of degree. I think the number of city residents that use the commuter railroads is obviously much smaller than the number of suburbanites who use our subways and buses. But of course, there's interchange both ways. We're all in this together. By no means do any of my comments underestimate that we need better mass transit for the entire metropolitan region for all of our good. But I think if we don't fix the subway situation long term, then our lifestyle and our economy is undermined for all of us, and that's why I think it's job one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Savino.
Thank you, Senator Young. Thank you, Mayor, for your testimony. And since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to try and do this quickly. So first off, I share your concerns about the effects of the child welfare cuts, the loss of close-to-home funding, and the effect it will have on the implementation of Raise the Age. Tomorrow is the Human Service Budget hearing, so I assume we will be weighing in very heavily with the state agencies to try and explain how they think it makes sense. There's some discrepancies about close-to-home, but there's one thing I know. In 2012, when it went into effect, we had 900 young people at Rikers Island. Today, there's only 170 because we turned a lot of kids around through close to home. So I just want to echo my support for that. I'm not going to reiterate the comments about property taxes, although I did get my own bill recently, and it says my house is worth $500,000. There is nothing in that house worth $500,000, including me, Mr. Mayor. So this begs, this commission really does need to come forward. I think Senator Hannan covered a lot of what I wanted to say about the MTA, but I wish that we could come to some resolution. The Subway Action Plan is so critical to the immediate need while we search for the long-term solution, whether it's the Fix New York City proposal, the Move New York plan, which I've been supportive of. We need to find a real solution to it that has city and state working together, because after all, they are city residents and state residents as well who are suffering because of the delays on these trains. One issue I would like your help with respect to the MTA, you may not recall this, but 5 years ago, you stood at a subway station with myself and Assemblyman Cusick, and we introduced legislation based on the rise in subway sex crimes. That number continues to go up. As we speak, they're up 51% since last year. The NYPD does a great job on it, but we passed the legislation that you helped me draft in the Senate 5 times. So if you could use your considerable influence with some of the members of the Assembly to try and get it out of the Assembly, it's critically important to safety in the subways. And finally, I want to shift to an authority that you do have full control over, and that is the New York City Housing Authority. My staff spends more time talking to Brian Honan, I see him back there, than they probably do to their own family members. I represent 20 different housing developments, 14 in Coney Island, 6 in Staten Island, and there are others in Staten Island that are equally represented by Senator Lanza. The conditions of the New York City Housing Authority, as you know, are deplorable. Whether it's the lead paint scandal or mold in apartments or broken elevators or the boilers, or whatever the case may be. You know, and I've seen the back and forth about who's responsible for what. The state of New York I'm not going to deny that over the years there was a disinvestment, first on the federal level. The state did not put enough in, but we are trying with $300 million over the last 2 years. We need to know what's going to happen with that money and how people are going to begin to see improvements in the conditions that they live in. Whether it's cleaning the hallways would be a great step for some of the developments, to repairing roofs and windows. The conditions, again, that people live in are deplorable, and we would not allow any other landlord in the city of New York to get away with that. So I'm hoping that you can give me some explanation of what we're planning to do with the money the state is sending, the money that the city's putting in, and how we're going to see improvements in the lives of the people who live there.
So, Senator, thank you very much for all your comments. On this point, and look, I've spent a lot of time talking to residents of public housing. Over the years in public service, I spent a lot of time in those buildings. I have no illusions about the extent of the problem. As you know, for quite a while, we cited the figure that we determined at the beginning of the administration, $18 billion needed to bring all those buildings up to the quality levels that the residents deserved. That number is likely going up. Some other estimates have been as high as $25 billion. We got to be honest with people, and I do think residents understand and appreciate this point. You cannot make up for that magnitude of disinvestment over many decades with immediate actions. It's just not going to be everything we want it to be. Now, the fact that the city, unlike any time frame in the past, the city is committed now $2.1 billion in capital funding, $1.6 billion in expense funding. No one ever saw anything like that before, that kind of level of commitment. We're going to continue that. We're very committed to it, very devoted to it. It is leading to really big changes. The capital commitment means 900 to 1,000 roofs will be fixed, and that will address the mold issue in those buildings. Obviously, the new commitment we've made on boilers means for the 20 most troubled commitments, they're going to get not just boilers, but the whole buildings have to be redone to allow the heating systems to work. It's a massive undertaking. There's an immediate thing that would help, an immediate action that would help. We do have a proposal still before the state. It's now been months for the $200 million for boilers and elevators. It's still not been moved on by the executive branch. We would really appreciate your help in getting those resources to move. But the answer is, when we came in, we tried to jettison a lot of broken policies of the past. We ended the payments by NYCHA for policing, which made no sense. We ended the tax payments, the pilot payments that NYCHA made to the city of New York. We put forward a faster repair schedule, which we're adhering to. We obviously improved the public safety dynamic in a number of developments. We're going at the roof problem and the facade problem on a huge level. It's endless, honestly, but we intend to keep doing it and to make it better. And look, we have a new general manager. I don't know if you've ever worked with Vito Mastacella, but he's a living legend in this city government, and we're thrilled that he was ready to step into this role. I think he's going to help us to make some major improvements as well. But this will be, every day I'm mayor, we're going to be working on this because we're talking about decades of mistakes that we're trying to make up for.
I had a long conversation with Vito on Friday. I first questioned his sanity for taking on this role, but he is definitely prepared and ready to do it. Just one final point on NYCHA. I met with the chair 2 weeks ago in my office, and she expressed to me this concern about senior housing and that NYCHA would like to get out of the business of managing the senior developments. I'm not sure if that's an actual policy proposal or that's just her own thing, but I think it's something worth looking into. Some of the senior developments might benefit from an alternative managing style, perhaps with a social service component. Many of our seniors who are living alone, quite frankly, should no longer be alone. You come into senior housing at 65, but many of them live into their late 80s. Many of them are, since there's very little social services in these buildings, some of them are hoarding, they're suffering from dementia, no one visits them, and so I think it's worth a look at this and perhaps taking care of these properties separately from the overall asset.
It's a very fair point. It's not a policy matter. I think it's a legitimate question and a legitimate concern that you raised and the chair raised about we have to examine different approaches going forward. But I want to emphasize, because I get asked this everywhere I go, we are adamant about public housing remaining public.
we'll never accept any kind of privatization scheme. Doesn't mean we can't work with other management approaches that still could be helpful while maintaining public ownership and control. On the senior point, we have a bigger challenge in New York City and the whole state, the whole country, that we are going to have a bigger senior population than ever before. We really don't have the policies in place for it. We're going to try in the coming months to start to put together more comprehensive planning for a more senior city. But I think the point you make is a really good one, that there's a lot of seniors who would really benefit from being more supported and more connected. And smaller things too, like one of the things we announced in the preliminary budget, very small initiative, but one that we think will help a lot to help seniors who have extra space in their apartment or their home and are willing to rent that space out, to match them with someone appropriate so that they benefit from that income, but also someone who can do chores for them. It's a really interesting kind of communal approach to the reality of a more senior city. And we're excited about what that might allow us to do.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but thank you for your question, for your comment.
Thank you, Assemblyman Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for being here with us and for your testimony. Before I start my few questions, I also would like to make a quick statement by thanking you for running your sleeve and helping the people of Puerto Rico and having the Department of Police Department, the Fire Department, and workers from the City of New York to really go to Puerto Rico. And I do believe they're still there in Puerto Rico, some of them going back and forth. And on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico, I would like to really say thank you to you.
Thank you very much. And we will maintain long-term commitment to the people of Puerto Rico.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions regarding, I'm going to go first to the MTA. What percentage of the funding of the MTA is city, state, and federal?
I can't speak to the federal or the state, as I told you, in terms of direct funding from the city and our people. It's approximately $10 billion annually. And again, it's about 70% of MTA revenue comes from either people of New York City or people working in New York City or the city government directly.
The City of New York is projecting a surplus of $5+ billion for this year. We are talking about the congestion prices as we speak. I remember my days in OMB. I spent a lot of time in OMB. When Ed Koch would say to us, go there and find out more revenue. And we will do this analysis, and we come up with analysis of new ideas, new revenue producers for the City of New York, expecting that that will be used for social services, for education, and so on and so forth. One of my biggest fears and concerns about the congestion pricing is that once we do that, I want to make sure that that money will be earmarked for the purpose and the objective of what we are planning to do and use that money wisely. Would you agree?
I agree 100%, Assembly Member. And someone said to me the other day, there's all sorts of history of the public being asked to do things and promised that the money would be used one way, and then lo and behold, the money gets used a different way. That would be a situation that would be very damaging if any kind of revenue plan, whether it's my preferred option, which is millionaire's tax, or if people prefer congestion pricing or any other plan, if we all agreed on a revenue vision and then woke up to find the money went elsewhere, I've raised the concern in the past that some money that was focused and dedicated for the MTA, unfortunately, was migrated to other needs. I think that hurt the MTA. We don't want to see that happen again. So my fundamental belief is whatever revenue package is put together for the MTA, that money must be earmarked for New York City subways and buses. The need to fix our subway system and our bus system is massive. And again, it's the core of the regional economy. You can make this argument in very human terms. So many of our constituents, and you and I are Brooklynites, we live very near to each other. We know how much the lives of our constituents depend on subways and buses that run effectively. But literally, if you want to be more economic in your thinking, the entire regional economy hinges on our subway and bus system.
So that's where the money needs to be dedicated. It needs to be a lockbox. There need to be guarantees, legally binding guarantees against that money migrating out of city mass transit needs, and God forbid it migrated to other budgetary needs elsewhere. Whatever happens here has to come with real guarantees.
I also would like to echo my colleagues on the issue of NYCHA. As you know, I represent Red Hook, which is East and West Side, probably the third largest New York City housing complex in the city of New York. One of the issues that I have is you mentioned about $200 million for moving forward for developments, and 20 developments. Do Red Hook is part of that 20 developments?
We can get you the list, and that is, I want to emphasize that we've already put hundreds of millions of dollars into new heating systems previous to some of the challenges we faced this winter. You know that a lot of this came to the fore because we had some of the coldest temperatures in decades for a few weeks. So the new investment that we put in the budget is $200 million to focus on those 20 big developments with the biggest problems. But previously we had already put in hundreds of millions, and it's something we'll be committed to for the long haul. I can get you a list. I don't know specifically about Red Hook houses, but I'll get you a list.
I'm looking at the clock very quick. Very quick, to finalize, I also would like to ensure that as we're moving forward with the BQC, that we also pay attention to the BQE.
Yeah.
And I also, I have written a letter to the commissioner asking for air quality monitoring as a result that, as you know, we have a lot of asthma bronchitis, and if you go to PS1, PS314, PS506, and now change the number, 971, telecommunication, and PS29 in Henry Street, the index of absenteeism in their schools are higher than the people that are on the other side of 4th Avenue as a result of the emission that is coming out. So I hope that you can direct some of you folks to work with me very close to put air monitor quality monitoring in the Sunset Park area, including the BQE. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Croce.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate your testimony here today. I represent the 3rd Senate District on Long Island, Suffolk County, and as you're no doubt aware, we've had tremendous challenges and very violent killings by MS-13. It's only because of the hard work of local law enforcement and federal partners that we've been able to really turn the tide and bring to justice individuals who are suspected of committing some of these killings. I'll say full disclosure that I've had the opportunity to work with the NYPD over the years, and recently toured the academy under Commissioner O'Neill. I'm aware of your work, not only counterterrorism and our security here, but also abroad, the NYPD and their work abroad. So I'm extremely satisfied that we have the very, very best, I would say, models in leadership and in their profession in the NYPD. I am concerned about the ongoing flow of heroin that comes, of course, it's not produced here in the United States, but it does flow through our state and out to our island. The close cooperation between the federal authorities and our local law enforcement has been, as I said, essential in combating this. Our governor, in September of last year, put forward an executive order which detailed how state law enforcement could cooperate with federal law enforcement. I was wondering if you have any executive orders which limit the ability of federal law enforcement and city law enforcement to cooperate.
So thank you very much for the comments you made about the NYPD, and we pride ourselves on the kind of cooperation with all law enforcement entities. Part of what has happened in the fight against terror that has been a great success is the deepening relationship between the NYPD and the FBI and all the members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Not so long ago, there were some disconnects there. And unfortunately, in other parts of the world, we see disconnects between different law enforcement levels and entities, but here we actually have achieved a very high level of coordination in fighting terror. It's been one of the reasons that so many plots have been foiled. And we always want to work with our colleagues in all counties of the state in continuing that work. On the question of cooperation with the federal government, again, if you're talking about anti-terror, it's exceptional. If you're talking about the obvious question of immigration, we have a city law, in fact, it's not an executive order, it's a city law, that delineates the form of cooperation. There's 170 serious and violent offenses where we do cooperate, and we believe that's the right approach. We obviously, look, I would differentiate the two pieces very distinctly. When it comes to fighting crime and fighting terror, and you're exactly right that that gang is a horrendous affront to the people of our city, of your county, and the whole country. We're going to fight them at every corner. On the question of some of the national environment and the specific approach that we've seen ICE take in some cases, we disagree with some of the specific actions they've taken and the approach they've taken. We still will follow our own law, obviously, in terms of cooperation, but there's other areas where we have a disagreement, most notably on asking people documentation status. And this is something Commissioner O'Neill feels very strongly about, Commissioner Bratton felt strongly about before him, and to be fair and to show it's bipartisan, it was a policy that Mayor Giuliani had in place, just as I do. The NYPD will not ask documentation status because we must maintain open communication with all immigrant communities, and we have millions of immigrant New Yorkers. So, excuse me, so just to say that's something we feel adamantly about, and we do have a difference with the federal government, but there are still obviously areas where we cooperate, and particularly in the fight against terror, we have close cooperation.
So I would categorize what has been happening in my community and the individuals perpetrating it. It's not simply a criminal organization, but the tactics they use are akin to some of the most successful terrorist groups, and we refer to it as narco-terrorism, which I think is a more accurate way to describe it. I would just like to follow up to ask, has the City of New York received from the Department of Justice or Homeland Security or any other federal agency any notices that you could be in jeopardy of losing federal monies? We've seen recently a very public one about road signs, but this is far more important to me, and I'd like to know if the federal government has put you on notice that there could be holes in your budget this year that the legislature should be aware of.
Well, absolutely, and this has now been going on for a year, and it refers to the Burn Grant program.
And what's that amount, sir?
Say again?
What's the amount that could be in jeopardy?
We're gonna check right now the exact amount, but the threat remains. There has not been a specific budgetary action taken, but the threat has been reiterated many times, and our answer remains consistent. We believe we are functioning 100% within federal law and within the recent decision of the Supreme Court in 2012, and we're doing what is appropriate to protect our city. Again, if this ever ends up coming to loggerheads, we'll go into court to resolve it, but we feel very strongly that our position is in compliance with both federal law and our city law.
So this is specifically your reading of 8 U.S.C. 1324, which talks about harboring?
I'm not a lawyer, so you'll forgive me, I can't quote the chapter and verse. But again,
But there is some recognition that there could be a legal problem if you're citing that you may have to go to court to rectify it.
This emanates from the President's executive order early in the administration?
Sir, the federal law has been in place for decades. It's
Again,
still there.
Forgive me when I say something that's not lawyerly, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm just trying to do the logic pattern. The initial difference was put down through the executive order. We said at the time we still believe that everything we've been doing is consistent with federal law and city law. There's been several letters since with the threats you referred to. We continue to maintain our position. We have not seen any funding cut off. The funding is specifically funding for the NYPD, but has not been cut off to date.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Assemblyman Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mayor de Blasio. Thank you for being here and answering all of our many, many questions. I would like to go back to the MTA, and I would like to ask you to kind of more broadly explain your views on congestion pricing and whether or not you've spoken with the governor or anyone from the state about a congestion pricing plan, and what things would you need to see in a congestion pricing plan to support it?
I've had numerous conversations with the governor on this topic, both before this proposal came out and since. I've been consistent about that lockbox point. It's the single greatest concern I have right now. Previously, I would have said that the older proposals we saw related to congestion pricing immediately put particular demands on the people of Brooklyn and Queens, which is a clear majority of New Yorkers. It's 5 million people almost, without any guarantees in return of investment in the mass transit needs of the people of Brooklyn and Queens. This new plan is a step forward because by taking the bridges out of the equation, it does a better job of addressing that central concern. We still don't see answers on some of the hardship issues I've raised, which I think are legitimate. You will know from your district, which I have the honor of living in, that there are plenty of people who are not well off, who have reasons they have to go into the core of Manhattan for medical appointments and other matters. We need to think about how we handle that. But the biggest issue right now for me is the guarantee, and a legally binding guarantee, that any money derived from a congestion pricing system would be spent on subways and buses in New York City. I think you'll understand my concern that we've seen money in the past move away from its intended purpose. If government is not obligated to keep that money focused on the needs of the MTA and the people in New York City, I fear the money might be used for other purposes. So that's what I would argue we all need to work on together, and we're ready to work closely with this legislature to figure out something that would be fair. That's the most central concern. There's also a host of details. We don't actually have a full proposal or full piece of legislation.
I mean, I think we can agree that, yes, we don't have the exact details, but the broad strokes of some form of congestion zone south of 60th Street, and if you cross the East River Bridges and don't access either the West Side Highway or the FDR Drive, that you would pay a fee, and then for-hire vehicles would have an additional surcharge in that zone, at least during major business hours, Monday through Friday, and possibly on weekends, that is the general broad strokes of that plan. And do you support those broad strokes? And I think just taking into account that, you know, Comptroller DiNapoli in November of 2017 put out a report that said the 2020-2024 capital plan of the MTA will most likely see a larger shortfall than the 2015-2019 capital plan, which was over $15 billion. So we could see a possible, and considering that still that capital plan has a $7 billion shortfall, we could see upwards of a $20 billion shortfall. We need a direct revenue stream. And would you support those broad strokes of 60th Street coming into the Central Business District, excluding if you get onto the FDR or West Side Highway?
A couple of things, and I will answer your specific question, but just an important frame. I still believe the single most effective and equitable approach to raising the resources we need for the long term in the MTA is the millionaire's tax. I don't, respectfully, and you're the experts, you're the people who do the ultimate voting, but I don't buy the conventional wisdom of what is viable here in Albany and what's not viable. I'm going by what I think is the best outcome. It's the most progressive form of taxation. It's obviously renewable. I think the fair fare is a really important idea in terms of ensuring that lower income New Yorkers can get around and get access to opportunity. So I still think it's the single best way to address the problem. If you say to me, okay, let's look at congestion pricing models, this model is the best I've seen to date, and I think that's progress. I'm much more comfortable with it than I was with the previous proposals. I have not seen enough detail to be fully comfortable because the devil really is in the details. The broad strokes, if you have a limited zone and if you do not include the bridges, that certainly makes some sense to me. I think the notion of the for-hire vehicles being treated equally is crucial. Taxis and all other forms of for-hire vehicles being equally responsible for producing some of the revenue for the MTA and setting that at the right dollar figure is crucial. But you will understand that I'm not, on behalf of 8.5 million people, I'm not going to buy into a plan until it's fully articulated with all of the ramifications and until I see that the money will be devoted, legally binding fashion will be devoted to the subways and buses in New York City. So my answer is clearly a step in the right direction. I'm ready to sit at the table with anyone and see if we could work together to get it to be something we could all agree on. But I want to be careful about those details.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Senator Hoylman.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. I know you've been patiently awaiting my question, but
you're a pillar of patience.
Yes, yes. I basically have two quick areas: subways and schools. First, thank you for your openness, open-mindedness on congestion pricing. I represent largely the congestion pricing zone, so you could call me the senator from the congestion pricing zone if you want. But my constituents, and I don't want you to ignore this part, the hardship that might be placed on them. I'm very supportive of congestion pricing, but we have to understand that there might be some folks who will drop their cars off at 60th Street. So we should be looking at things like residential parking, like the last plan a decade ago considered. Also, we want to ensure that we look at other vehicles, not just the for-hire vehicles, but tour buses. There's been a tripling of double-decker tour buses in Manhattan since about 2003. They add to a lot of congestion too, so we need to figure out how to deal with them. My specific question, though, is just a legal point. Do you think that a home rule message is required for congestion pricing?
Putting aside again that I'm not a lawyer, I think as a general rule, vast majority of things that affect the city of New York, of course we want that kind of process. We've got to be very careful when actions are taken up here that they represent the interests of the 8.5 million, almost 8.6 million New Yorkers. What I'd like to see here is a very collegial process where we all work together fashioning whatever proposals. Again, I state my devotion to the millionaire's tax. There may be entirely different ideas beyond the millionaire's tax and congestion pricing that should be looked at. But the very point you make, and it gets back to what Assemblymember Carroll was saying, part of why I always say the devil's in the details is you just raised a crucial point right there. What happens to folks who live along that border? And then does that have a domino effect that we have to address? We don't want to deal with that after the fact. We want to deal with it up front in a policy. So there has to be close coordination, in my view, between the legislature and the city determining whatever policy it is, and a home rule is one of the ways to guarantee that.
And on the schools issue, I really do applaud your leadership.
And wait, I'm going to give you a historical point. Our new state affairs director will weigh in.
The 2008 bill on congestion pricing did need a home rule.
Yes. I didn't know if you had changed your...
No, we think that's a good precedent.
On schools, thank you for your leadership over the last 4 years. As a public school parent, I appreciate the direction, the lowering of the temperature in the public schools, which previously were fraught with much more political dissension. What is the impact of this shift that you note in your testimony of $144 million worth of costs currently borne by the state to the city to support charter schools? What's going to be the practical impact on the DOE budget?
I will start and then turn to Melanie. Look, it's not only the immediate, it's the slippery slope. When there's an unfunded mandate that grows, you wonder where it's going. So our budget director can talk to you about the pure dollar impact, which is very substantial, but I would also note our concern here is that this is, the charter school community now serves about almost 10% of our kids. It's very substantial if costs continue to be shifted. At the same time, I understand why people here are saying, let's go farther on fair funding. That's an immediate contradiction, because we'd like to take state resources and put them into fair funding, but we can't if we keep receiving additional unfunded mandates. Could you speak to the numbers?
And before you answer,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the selection of the new chancellor, which is so important to obviously parents. The citywide and community education councils have requested some sort of role in at least interviewing the candidates who you're going to be meeting and maybe providing some input. Is that something you'd commit to in some fashion?
I respect the concern, and I used to be a community school board member in the old structure, and I think very highly of the folks who serve on the CECs. We want to work closely with them. I don't think it's appropriate in a personnel decision to sort of crowdsource it. I think you have to handle such an important decision. This is someone who's going to govern over a $25 billion budget and be responsible for 1.1 million kids. That has to be done very sensitively, very carefully. We'll always welcome suggestions, but a decision like that has to be done.
I don't think they're looking to vet your decision. I think they're just looking to provide input and give you their assessment.
I would welcome, and I always have welcomed, it's very personal since I had a similar role myself, ideas, if there's names that people want to put forward or specific characteristics, I would always welcome that. And anything that could be done on that front. Just on the numbers, hold on one second, go ahead.
Sure. So on the charter school impact, it's $120 million for tuition, and the balance is for leases, and essentially it equates to what would be an unfunded mandate, meaning we have to maintain the tuition and the lease payments for the schools, and it would be very difficult for us to do that and maintain it without hurting instruction.
Thank you, Assemblyman Weprin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for coming up, as you do each and every year, and spending probably more time than you'd like to spend in Albany since you've been in office. As you know, I chair the Corrections Committee in the Assembly, and I work very closely with your administration, and I want to commend you on recent accomplishments of reducing the population at Rikers Island to below 9,000 individuals, which you referred to earlier, and also the initiative that you've launched to help keep women out of jail. But I've noticed that there has been some challenges with efforts to reduce violence, specifically slashings and stabbings at Rikers Island. And as you know, I currently have a bill in the Assembly which would allow the use of ionizing body scanners at Rikers, which is supported by the city, as well as by a number of advocacy groups, including the Osborne Association and the Fortune Society. Could you comment about, first, why these scanners are needed, and also some of the safeguards that the city has committed to or will commit in order to prevent the overuse of these scanners?
Thank you, Assembly Member, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. Yes, we need these scanners. There's no two ways about it. We have to drive down any form of violence, any and all forms of violence in our correction system. Let's be blunt. One of the problems is contraband and weapons getting into the facility. Both are related to violence. And we don't have the best modern technology being employed to stop that. We've done a host of other things, and many of them have worked. We have now cameras, internal security cameras throughout the facilities. We have more rigorous screening procedures. We have a lot of investigatory activity, and a number of people have been arrested and prosecuted who unfortunately broke the laws and rules. But we don't have modern scanners, and it's hurting our ability to keep people safe, our correction officers and inmates. So we have to have them. Now, there's been valid concerns raised about health. We have worked with our Department of Health to address those. I believe that the protocols we're talking about now fully address the health concerns. But I would argue that not only have we effectively answered those concerns, but the absence of scanners is causing a clear and present danger and a different kind of health concern that's called violence. and it's unconscionable to let it continue. So I beseech you and your colleagues to please help us this session get this bill passed so we can finally put those scanners in.
Well,
Mr. Mayor, I just want to point out, the Senate's passed my bill to do exactly that because we agree with you.
Great minds think alike, Senator. Thank you. Bipartisan cooperation here.
Okay,
Thank you.
We'll look forward to working with you, Mr. Mayor, on getting it done this year. One other topic along the correction area. I visited Rikers Island several times, but I've also had the opportunity to visit some of the alternatives to incarceration and diversion programs, some actually very close to my assembly district in Queens, as well as others in Manhattan and other boroughs. When I visited each of these places, I noticed that in addition to an atmosphere of hope, there was a large focus on providing community support, addiction and mental health treatment, and other services to give individuals with what they needed to stay out of jail. As a large proponent of strengthening of family and community ties and supporter of ATI and diversionary programs, I'm curious to hear more about some of the city's recent efforts to expand behavioral health services and other supports for people looking to stay out of jail.
Well, thank you for that, Assembly Member. We believe fundamentally that these are smart investments. We know, first of all, tragically, in our correction system, about 40% of the folks incarcerated have some identified mental health challenge. The big initiative we've undertaken, of course, is the Thrive NYC initiative that my wife Charlene leads. And the goal there going forward is to identify these problems as early as possible, even going as early as pre-K, and address them so those individuals never end up in the criminal justice system to begin with. But since that will take some time, we know there's a lot of mental health challenges. We think that addressing them in the here and now actually will reduce recidivism. It's one of the pieces of our effort to reduce the number of women who end up in our jails and to reduce recidivism among women. We think there are specific mental health supports that would be greatly valuable, and we focused in particular on inmates who have children. But across the board, I think we have missed the opportunity. You know, whenever government comes in contact with someone and we have a chance to get them the help they need, that should be considered a precious opportunity. Unfortunately, the protocol in the past, whether it was for corrections or police or education, was not to seize that moment. Right now, corrections made a sea change, NYPD as well, in terms of a lot more training in how to handle mental health situations, and then a lot more supports that are provided that they can connect people to right away. And that's the model we're working on.
Well, I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you on those programs as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your testimony, and also Ms. Hartzog and Ms. Brown. Congratulations on your relatively new appointments, and thank you for being here today. You spent a lot of time on the MTA today, and I'm not going to, with my 5 minutes, I'm not going to repeat a lot of that, just to say that I share your commitment to ensuring that we find a way to balance the needs of the city and the state in terms of finding a full funding solution. And really, ultimately, the goal is to fully fund the aspects of the capital plan that are necessary to ensure the system is in a high state of repair, and also that we serve many constituencies that are underserved by the system. Similarly, I know there's been quite a bit of dialogue on the BQE design-build question. It runs through my district, and I was happy to be joined by just about all of the senators in Staten Island and Brooklyn of both parties in calling for design build to be part of this budget so that we can get it done, and join the city in making sure that the contracting documents that have to go out this spring can factor in design build authorization, and that'll be a continuing dialogue here. I want to focus on public housing a little more. You had a dialogue a moment ago with Senator Savino, who, for the record, I think is worth every penny of the $500,000 capital investment in housing her in her district that she mentioned. But just the many of us in Albany, including members of the IDC and members of my conference and certainly members of the Assembly Democratic Conference have been calling for a number of years now for a $500 million investment by the state each year in NYCHA. And yet we've seen $100 million that was carefully constructed so it couldn't be used for major capital needs, and another $200 million that was welcome, that was primarily for boilers and elevators last year, and no new money at all in this year's budget. So I'd like to, if you would, just speak. You've taken a different path, and the city has put a very substantial amount of money into NYCHA. I just want to understand, this is a federal authority, a federally created program. It was the federal government's primary responsibility for a long time. Can you just talk about why you think the city and the state should be investing city and state capital dollars in NYCHA?
Absolutely, and I'm happy to call you Senator. I don't know if I've had a chance to use the title yet, so congratulations again.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is the single strongest element of affordable housing in New York City. 400,000 people live in public housing. It's the size of many major American cities. And look, the model was created to be federally funded. You're exactly right. But the fact that the federal government walked away from that, and the fact that the state government has had a very limited role, does not negate the fact that this is 400,000 human beings who are part of the backbone of New York City. These are working people. These are salt-of-the-earth folks who, you know, many of them are public workers, and many of them are people who have been in their neighborhoods their whole lives and been part of keeping neighborhoods strong even in the tough times. So we got to be committed to the long-term needs of public housing. By the way, many other cities that destroyed their public housing stock, they live to rue the day because now they have experienced gentrification and they end up with communities that have no economic balance and there's no place for working people. So we got to protect it. The immediate option, I agree with your point that the best thing would be an ongoing state commitment and someday to renew the federal commitment. But in the absence of that, specifically to match the $200 million capital commitment we've made for new boilers and heating systems, and to finish the previous funding, as you said, that original $100 million, we still have not seen some of that money. That's 3 years ago, if my memory serves. And then the more recent $200 million, we still have not gotten approval on, even though that proposal has been in the hands of the executive branch for now over 2 months. So right there, getting us the previously allocated funding and matching the $200 million we're putting into heating would be a very, very helpful step.
Great, thank you. Just on a more parochial issue, 85 Bowery, it's a building in my district that where 29 families, 95 people and 17, including 17 children, were vacated by the buildings department for safety concerns. Your office and the relevant city agencies, as well as the state HCR, have been involved. I think it's fair to say there was some chaos in the initial vacate process that may have been avoidable with better communication in advance from the city to the tenants. But we've got ongoing concerns that we need to ensure that the landlord is making the repairs that are necessary to get people back into their homes, and that the residents have their rights protected and their services. Just two-part question. First, would you commit to us to work once the, sort of this, beyond this problem, whether we can talk about what the protocol ought to be when you're doing a vacate order, especially in places where there might be language barriers for people understanding what's going on? And secondly, do we have your ongoing commitment that the administration will continue to work with us until all these people are back in their homes?
You want to start on that?
Sure. This definitely is an issue that the agencies involved have been working on daily. There's regular conversations that happen currently between the tenant association and the city. So this is something that we're definitely on top of. The goal is absolutely to return this building to safe and habitable homes for people to live in. And I think, yes, we should talk about, after people are allowed to get back in their homes, we should talk about tenant harassment and all those different things.
Yeah, and I would say that your point is very well taken, Senator. We need to perfect a model here, because you're right, this was not handled the way we would ideally want it to, and the left hand and the right hand weren't coordinated, and it's one we have to do better on. We're going to have these kind of problems because of the actions of some landlords, not the majority of landlords, but some landlords who don't do the right thing, and we have to be smarter about how we handle the aftermath of that.
Right. And I would just note that the city was very responsive. We had requested that these families they had originally been located in a hotel that was quite distant from their community, and they were all relocated. There is now a hotel available that's very nearby the current building. So we appreciate the work on an ongoing basis, but you know, sometimes priorities change as we go forward. So we just want to join you in staying on top of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Senator Rivera.
Hello, Mr. Mayor. I only have 5 minutes, so I'll get right to it. A few of the questions have been asked already, but I wanted to talk about a couple of things that we have not spoken about. First, as far as education is concerned, I'm sure that you were, as the rest of us were, horrified to read the story about what happened in MS 118 last week. This is related to the teacher who was teaching a class on slavery and thought it necessary to walk over the back of black students. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about maybe that's case specifically, but more importantly about the need for competent, culturally competent teachers and some of the training that needs to happen. That's one of the things, so let's go with that first.
Yeah, that was a deeply troubling incident. I just want to say it does not reflect the values of this city, and nor of what we teach our teachers to do. And we're going to investigate that fully, because we need to know how anything like that could have happened and where that got missed, because if anybody was suggesting to do such a thing, it should have been vetoed immediately, but we don't have all those facts yet. But very troubling and unacceptable situation.
And what is your plan as far as I mean, obviously this is not something that happens all the time, thankfully, right. But what is your plan about as far as training teachers to make sure, or just at least setting up something so that we can assess whether anybody's even thinking about doing craziness like this, so it does not happen? I
do think this is an extreme rarity. And I think that's a good sign that it's an extreme rarity. The training that we now do, because we have greatly expanded professional development time, includes cultural sensitivity and teaching for a multicultural environment and anti-bias training. That's part of what we do. It's something that we will continue to deepen over time. But, I think one of the things that really is enunciated, the Chancellor talks about this a lot, is, we have to be a positive model as a school system in a country that's really grappling with these issues right now. We have to be a very positive model as a school system, respecting all kids and all backgrounds. And in general, I think we're doing that, but we're putting some real emphasis in that in the professional development process.
Well, I'd like to follow up later on some of the specifics as far as what you're trying to do, but I want to move on to another one related to health. Specifically, Senator Marchione earlier talked about the opioid crisis, and I certainly know that it has been a focus of yours, certainly has been a focus of mine in the time that I've been here. But I wanted to ask about a specific policy, in particular supervised injection facilities. Just last week, there was a bill that was introduced by Assemblymember Rosenthal, which seeks to establish in the state of New York, in the state of New York. And I know that I'm aware that there is a study by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene that was looking into the feasibility of this. Can you tell us when that report will be released?
That's still being discussed between the different agencies. The Department of Health is involved, NYPD is involved. That's something we will be addressing soon. And I always say to people, when I say soon, I mean soon, or I wouldn't use that word. I don't have a date certain, but it's something that, is almost to the point where we can talk about it publicly. Very complex matter, as you know.
Indeed.
A proposal that obviously is a serious one and is approached utilized in some other places in the world. But we really want to analyze the information we're receiving, both with the Health Department and NYPD, and then come out with some public analysis.
I look forward to the release of that report. I, along with many of my colleagues, strongly believe that that addiction is a public health issue, not a criminal justice one. And I want to make sure that we go down that road, and as we address addiction concerns, that we do so across the board in all communities, not just with doctors' kids, but certainly in every community that has had, particularly those that have been impacted by opioid addiction and overdose before. Last but not least, I only have a minute. Last week, we had the Joe Loda here for about 5 hours, as you heard earlier. One of the questions that I asked him, I termed it a radical rejiggering. That was me trying to be alliterative, but the core question is the percentage. I was trying to get something out of him that I did not get out of him, and it had to do with how much, as far as capital costs are concerned, the way that historically, more specifically, the percentage that the city covers now, and in the new proposal, what is the percentage that the city would be asked to cover, and he didn't give me one. I figured that you folks have done the numbers based on what you're seeing in the budget proposal. So if you have any of that, if you could share it with us, I'd appreciate it. And thank you for being here, Mr. Mayor.
Just to make sure, thank you. Just to make sure I understand fully what you're saying. If you're referring to the proposal in the executive budget,
that is correct.
The
way it would change, what has been historically the responsibility of the city as it relates to capital costs for the MTA, and what this would do to change it. As far as percentage, if we say 100, right now let's say it covers 30, I don't know what it is, right, 30 to 70 for the state, this would change it to what, if you have that.
I'm going to start broadly and then pass to Melanie. Look, it's a sea change to talk about going from what the law, and I emphasize the law itself, state law, and everything we've seen in practice for 65 years makes abundantly clear that the city is not responsible for the capital costs. The capital costs are huge, ultimately, and given what Mr. Loda, I think, has rightfully said about the future of the MTA, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars in shifted expenses, which is an insupportable number. That's before you even talk about the value capture. So, I mean, one thing I'm going to ask our budget director to do is to give you a sense of if we lost tens of billions of dollars, what that would do to all the other areas in our capital budget.
Well, I mean, the value capture alone in terms of property taxes is taking away billions of dollars from us. And so it would essentially wipe out many of our critical projects that we currently have budgeted, as you said before, Mr. Mayor, in infrastructure. And it also affects our operating revenues in terms of our expense budget as well. It's not just capital, it also affects our expense. Property taxes support our operating budget.
Right, I'll just add very quickly that I think when the value capture idea was put out, I mean, I think it sounded an alarm for localities all over. The notion that any action could be taken to reach into their local revenue, into their property tax revenue, is very dangerous for many reasons. That money is the day-to-day expense money for police, fire, sanitation, schools. You take away that money, you're going to see cuts in those areas. On the capital side, what does tens of billions mean? Forget, wherever I go to these town hall meetings, and so many of you have been there, we would not be doing new school construction. We would not be doing additional work on roads and bridges. We would not be doing repaving. We would not be doing the affordable housing program if we lost that kind of level of money. All of these new initiatives that people have demanded would have to be suspended. There's no way we could pay for them.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I want to go back to the MTA funding issue. And as was pointed out by Senator Hannan, the 2015 to 19 MTA capital plan totals about $30 billion. And of this total, $8.64 billion, or 28.9%, will be contributed by the state, and only $2.492 billion, or 8.3%, will be contributed by the city. Now, you today have said several times that the city is not legally responsible for the capital costs for the MTA. I would say to you, Mr. Mayor, that those statements are not correct. Let me refer you to the law. Chapter 200 of the laws of 1953 originally created the New York City Transit Authority and provided that the operation of the city's subway system be provided by the authority pursuant to a master lease. Within the original chapter, the city was explicitly responsible for all capital costs for projects having a period of probably usefulness of 5 years or more, which would include all major capital construction. That funding obligation and authority to approve remain in place to this very day. Subsequently, legislation was passed to provide that the City Board of Estimate, which is now you, Mr. Mayor, needs to approve capital costs exceeding $5 million. This did not diminish the city's responsibility, but ensured that the city would be able to approve projects and costs necessary for the system, since you are responsible. So, based on the law, would you explain to us why you feel it's appropriate for the state to commit 3.5 times the city's own capital commitment in order to fund primarily city-centered transit investments?
Madam Chair, just deepest respect, absolutely disagree with your legal interpretation. This is something
I'm
my
reading
corporation
from the law,
counsel.
Mr. Mayor.
Excuse me?
I'm reading from the law.
Again, respectfully, you're reading from the law and then adding your interpretation, which we all do. And I would argue to you that my corporation counsel has looked at the same exact law, and we also looked at 65 years of practice, and we come to a very different conclusion. This obviously is an issue that could have come up at any time in the last 65 years. It has not, and I think it hasn't for a reason, because the power to make the decisions devolved to the state. Mr. Loda was here. Mr. Loda was named by the governor. There was no consultation with me in that process. I had no vote in that process. The budget was determined without any involvement of the city. Let's face it, the state has been running the MTA for decades now. And the reality is that the city is responsible for a whole host of areas that we must provide for the people of the city, public safety, education, et cetera. There's no safety net. I think we can honestly say at this point in history, if there was a crisis in the economy or there was a massive cutoff in federal aid, which is a real conceivable possibility, the state would not be in a position to help the city any longer. We are on our own to determine our own fiscal future, which is why we're trying to protect the interests of over 8.5 million people and the economy of the whole state by keeping reserves in place. But right now, the reality is we do not make the decisions for the MTA, and we have not been held liable, legally or otherwise, for the capital costs. That notwithstanding, we have contributed in a variety of ways, and we look forward to cooperating on a long-term solution to the problem. We think there are long-term solutions we could all agree upon.
And I would just add that the state has not funded as much as the city historically in terms of the MTA's overall capital plan. Between 1982 and 2014, the state was at 5%, and the city was at 7%, and we're now at 8.3%.
Thank you for that. And I would say that the state has had to step in over the years. I agree with that due to failures on the city's part. But at the end of the day, the city legally is responsible for capital costs. And Mr. Mayor, you have raised the tax levy over and over and over again. You said today that you have a $5 billion surplus, and I don't understand why the city can't contribute more toward the capital costs. You say yourself how much people depend on an operating subway and bus system, how crucial it is to people's lives. And I would ask that the city reconsider and follow the law and contribute more toward capital costs and operating costs of the subway system.
Senator, I've tried to be very consistent about the fact that we want to work together on the solution. We believe with the MTA's existing resources, they can address the immediate problem if they would allocate money to the greatest needs. We also believe that the money that was taken out of the MTA budget should be returned to it. It's a substantial amount of money. And we believe that we can work together on a long-term funding source. That would be the best solution for all of us.
Thank you. I just want to switch over to the New York City Housing Authority now. And I thought it might be we should look at, it would be instructive and we should look at a timeline. So just going over it. On December 17th, 2014, Politico New York reported on an audit released by City Controller Scott Stringer, which accused NYCHA for potentially missing $692 million in federal dollars due to widespread mismanagement of the authority. It failed to meet specific guidelines in the application process, and by that I mean the city, regarding hot water heaters, upgrading lighting, replacement of outdated heating plants, and so on. On November 17, 2017, the New York Daily News reported that 2 top NYCHA managers were forced to submit their resignations while a 3rd manager was demoted. The resignations and demotions of managers Brian Clark, Luis Ponce, and Jay Krantz, respectively, were in response to their knowing that lead paint testing was not being conducted in apartments, and they were lying to HUD officials. On November 19, 2017, the New York Daily News reported that the Department of Investigations slammed NYCHA for systematic mismanagement following a probe which determined NYCHA had failed to perform required lead inspections in these apartments and lied. DOI commented, "This is the 4th time in less than 2 years that DOI has done an investigation that has found systemic mismanagement at NYCHA that put tenants at risk. Previously, probes by the DOI found that NYCHA was not properly inspecting smoke detectors in apartments, was not performing proper elevator maintenance, and did not have a system in place to prevent violent criminals from living on NYCHA premises." On January 8th, the New York Post reported on City Comptroller Scott Stringer's response to the NYCHA mismanagement, and according to Mr. Stringer, NYCHA may have used inadequate criteria to select boilers to replace those in 2016 as part of a 5-year capital plan. On January 9th, the New York Post reported that $100 million in capital funding was set aside for NYCHA in 2016, but was not used for boilers. On January 22nd, the New York Daily News reported that NYCHA General Manager Michael Kelly announced his resignation. Kelly was involved in NYCHA's attempts to conceal its lead paint inspection failures, which were done for a year, from both current tenants and the public. For more than a year, both Shola, Olatoya, and the city were aware that apartment lead testing was not being conducted, and as subsequently, both local law and HUD regulations were being violated. On January 27th of this year, the New York Daily News reported that a Bronx jury reached a $57 million verdict against NYCHA. Tisha Jones' daughter registered dangerous levels of lead in her blood after living in a lead-tainted NYCHA apartment. Tisha's daughter, Dakota, 4 years old in January of 2010, registered a level of 45 micrograms per deciliter in her blood. The acceptable level is 5 micrograms. Obviously, lead exposure can greatly affect the neural development of children and cause developmental delays. The results of Dakota's individual education plan placed her in special education comments. Tisha's comments were, quote, "I was mortified. They, NYCHA, sent me a letter every year stating that there's no lead in the apartment. Here I was thinking I was safe, taking care of my children." On January 28th, the New York Daily News reported that the New York City Public Advocate, Letitia James, had called upon Mayor de Blasio to remove Olatoya as the head of NYCHA because of her lying under oath. Residents have reported that no heat or running hot water has been available this winter. Mayor de Blasio has said that Olatoya will stay as the head of NYCHA because of the good she has done through the improvement of agency finances and quickness of repairs. And in fact, Mr. Mayor, on Good Day New York, you praised Olatoya saying, quote, "When you look at the head of an organization who has steadily, consistently improved a very troubled organization, guess what? She needs to stay for the good of those residents." And finally, on January 31st, the New York Post reported that David Farber, NYCHA's general counsel and executive vice president for legal affairs, was stepping down. The New York City Department of Investigation released information that NYCHA certified to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that mandated lead paint testing was completed throughout the 4,200 NYCHA apartments, and NYCHA knew that was inaccurate. And Shola Olatoya, the authority chairwoman, remains at the head of NYCHA. So a very basic but burning question is, Mr. Mayor, why is Shola Olatoya still at NYCHA?
Madam Chair, you listed a number of items, and I want to note that some of them are media accounts, some of them are audits by elected officials, and I respect all elected officials, but may not agree with all the conclusions of their audits. There are some real issues. We've been very open about those real issues, but those issues, particularly when it comes to the question of lead, predate this administration and predate this chair at NYCHA. When she found out what had happened, she took the steps to address it. Now there have been full inspections twice of all appropriate apartments, and there's been full remediation. So the fact is that is a problem that we inherited that's now being addressed. The fact is that the agency was on the verge of bankruptcy, and she created a plan to right the ship and put it on a firm financial footing. That she created a plan with her colleagues to make repairs happen much more quickly, to fix roofs better, to go down a list, to improve public safety. And a number of developments, the increase in public safety is striking. I'm not for a moment going to miss the fact that something went wrong on the lead paint issue. I'm not happy about it. It was not handled the way I would have liked, but the solutions have been put in place, and we've been open about the mistakes. So I stand by her because she has achieved a lot for 400,000 people, and she will continue to.
But Mr. Mayor, you say that these are problems that were predated, I guess, recent history, but the Department of Investigation determined that NYCHA failed to conduct the mandatory safety inspections for lead paint over 4 years beginning in 2013. And also that there were reports filed to the federal government that falsified the information and said that NYCHA did indeed do those inspections.
Madam Chair, this has been covered time and time again, and we've been working with the United States Attorney on this issue for almost 2 years, so I'm happy to say what I've said publicly many times. 2013, there was a different mayor, and there was a different chair of NYCHA.
But this is over 4 years, the past 4
But
years.
I want to affirm the point. It is a true statement that the local law was violated in the previous administration, that the inspections were stopped and the remediation effort was stopped. That should never have happened. It's also a true statement that when we came into office and the chair came in and her staff came in, they did not recognize that that discontinuity had occurred. When it became apparent to them, they alerted the federal government immediately. All this has been documented. The federal regional administrator has said on record, it's true that as soon as the city, or excuse me, as soon as NYCHA understood the situation, they reported it to the federal government.
But don't the people who live in NYCHA apartments deserve better? I mean, we've had these issues that have stacked up over the years. They're in unsafe conditions, conditions that are detrimental to their health and well-being, conditions where there's crime in these housing units or housing facilities. Don't they deserve better than that? And I think that someone ultimately needs to be held accountable for that. So I don't understand why you seem to be laying the blame on everybody else, but there's an old saying, the buck stops here, and why isn't Shola Olatoya being dismissed?
You know, Madam Chair, respectfully, you've evinced some information about NYCHA, but I, every day, serve the people of my city. I've spent a lot of time in public housing. I know a lot of people who live in public housing. I've seen the improvements that she's been able to achieve, and I respectfully think it is very reductionist to add certain facts up and say someone needs to be dismissed, even though they're getting a lot of good work done for the people they serve. And there have been problems. When you run a facility, a set of facilities as big as NYCHA with decades of disinvestment, of course there's problems. But you mentioned public safety. Respectfully, Madam Chair, if you looked at the facts, you would see how public safety has greatly improved in NYCHA in the last 4 years. And the chair has worked closely, Chair Olatoye has worked closely with the NYPD to achieve that change. And I believe the NYPD are the leading experts in public safety in this nation. They will affirm to you how much progress has been made in public safety in NYCHA.
Respectfully, Mr. Mayor, I think you're defending the indefensible, but at this point I'll turn it over to Senator Krueger.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So 8.5 million people. I live there. Most people actually think the city's doing quite well. Our economy our public safety, our schools, and despite continuing problems with housing and public housing, even seeing improvements there. So sometimes I think you come up here and you might get a little bit of a different perception from people who don't spend their lives in the city of New York. But I want to ask you specifically about the changes from the federal tax reform and the proposals the governor's task force made about possible ways to address the new dilemma for people living in high property tax, high local and state tax areas, and certainly many sections of New York City fall into that category. So do you have a position on some of the governor's task force proposals, i.e. A payroll tax, math deduction model, or the charitable contribution for school and local income tax?
I'll start and pass to the budget director. One, we're committed to work with the governor, work with the legislature, because we think the removal of deductibility was a huge mistake. Two, we do think there's a way, although we're the first to say we have not seen working together. We haven't found the perfect formula. I would argue the more positive option is around payroll tax, but let me have the budget director jump in there.
Thank you. We are very supportive of the payroll tax and of the state's effort to look at an unincorporated business tax. As you know, we have one in New York City. We have been in communication with the state on how best to do that and working with them. Lots of complications on how that would actually get implemented and done at the state level. But overall, as the mayor said, we very much support it, and also we're very supportive of trying to figure out how we decouple the impact of the property tax, the personal income tax, so that it's not a hit as much on single filers especially.
And this was also raised before, and I think you partly answered the question. So the governor's value
capture?
Thank you, value capture. I drove across from the Lincoln Tunnel. I was in New Jersey for a Shiva, drove across the Lincoln Tunnel, and my GPS said, you're now a mile from 2nd Avenue. And I was basically on 10th Avenue. So in his proposal, that any time there would be an MTA major project of $100 million or more, which is pretty much all MTA projects as far as I can tell, that they could capture 75% in the increased property tax assessments for anything within a mile. And I'm thinking from Manhattan.
It would essentially cover most of Manhattan.
It's
yes.
pretty much all of Manhattan, and then it's forever, and it's not even dedicated to the area where the impacts are being felt. So
that's correct.
You said billions before. Have you actually, I don't know, tried to do like just one example projection? If they, I don't know, I'm hoping very much in my lifetime we continue the 2nd Avenue subway beyond 63rd heading south. So even if you're just looking at one or two additional extensions of just one subway line, it seems that we could be sucking property tax money away from the city at an incredible rate. So.
Yes, I mean, I don't think we even need to do an estimate on that. If you just looked at 2nd Avenue subway, I could tell you it probably, right, at least is over $3 billion of impact to us.
And has anybody ever done a final tally on the 7-line model? Because that was an actual agreement to pay for the 7-line with increased property value assessment, although that was an area where we were going to be significantly expanding a new part of the city that didn't have a lot going for it. And even then, we ended up cutting out 1 or 2 of the stops. So has somebody in the city done an evaluation of who paid what for that project?
Yes, and I would have to get back to you on the particulars of that, but I think that's a clear example where we did have an agreement with the state on right value capture without having it written into actual right law that it would happen in this way.
Right, and Senator, just to say that I think that's the crucial point, that these are specific agreements that should be reached case by case. To legislate them is dangerous, and by the way, again, I would say localities all over the state would share my concern that if there's a Pandora's box opened here where the state can reach into local revenue and local property tax decisions, it's very dangerous. But if you say here's an option, here's an opportunity, can we find a way to do it together? Yeah, but not on the basis of state law. It should be on the basis of two jurisdictions trying to find mutual benefit.
And I raised when Joe Loda was here that, in fact, I was part of the discussions that were completed in the East Midtown rezoning, where there were commitments for money for MTA needs, but a worked-out agreement between the city, the MTA, the community, and the recognition that there were going to be wins and losses in rezoning East Midtown, and that many different things needed to be addressed. And I would think that would be true in any significant structural change.
That's right, and it was a very thorny, complicated reality, but we got there. We all found a way to get to an agreement, and it's the right model.
Thank you.
So pretty close to on time, the time promised for government work. Mr. Mayor,
right.
thank you for
all
the time you've spent with us and responding to all our questions.
Thank you very much to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Next, we'll be hearing from New York City Controller Scott Stringer.
I get two of those, actually.